The dust cloud on the horizon was disappearing fast, and with it, any hope of survival. Clara Whitmore stood frozen on the endless Colorado plains, her heart pounding as the terrible truth settled in. Her own family had left her to die, abandoned, betrayed, alone. With nothing but a broken trunk and the clothes on her back, she faced a choice between slow death under the merciless sun or something even worse in the darkness to come. But then, a shadow appeared on the ridge, a lone rider, and everything was about to change. If you want to see how this incredible journey unfolds, stay with me until the very end, hit that like button, and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The wind cut across the prairie like a knife, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush and something far more ominous, the smell of her own fear. Clara Whitmore's hands trembled as she clutched the worn handle of her broken trunk, watching the last wagon of the train shrink into a speck against the endless Colorado sky. The wheels that had carried her west for 3 months were now carrying away her last connection to everything she'd known, leaving her stranded in an ocean of grass and stone. 20 years old, and this was how it ended. She'd known something was wrong that morning, the way her Aunt Margaret had avoided her eyes during breakfast, the hushed conversation between her uncle and the wagon master, the deliberate coldness in their voices when they'd told her to wait here just a moment, while they dealt with a supposed wheel problem. That had been 2 hours ago. Clara sank to her knees beside the trunk, her dark traveling dress gathering dust that would never brush clean. The reality of her situation crashed over her in waves. No water, no food except a small parcel of dried biscuits, no weapon, no horse, and night would fall in less than 4 hours. She'd refused him. That's what this was about. Raymond Butcher, a man 3 times her age with whiskey on his breath and cruelty in his eyes, had wanted her as his third wife. Her uncle had arranged it all, promised her like livestock in exchange for parcels of land in the new Colorado settlement. When she'd said no, when she'd stood her ground despite the shouting and the threats, she'd sealed her fate. "Ungrateful girl," her aunt had hissed the night before, "after all we've done for you." All they'd done. Clara almost laughed at the bitter irony. They'd taken her in after her parents died of cholera in St. Louis, yes, but only because her father's will had left her a small inheritance they'd immediately seized. They'd given her a roof and daily bread, but extracted payment in endless labor and constant reminders of her burden to them. And now this, the final payment. Clara forced herself to stand, brushing the dust from her dress with shaking hands. Crying wouldn't help, panic wouldn't help. She needed to think. The horizon stretched in every direction, an endless roll of amber grassland broken only by distant purple mountains that seemed impossibly far away. The trail the wagons had followed was still visible, 2 parallel tracks cutting through the prairie grass, but following it on foot was suicide. Even if she could walk the 15 miles to the next water source, and she wasn't certain she could, there were other dangers out here. She'd heard the stories around the campfires, mountain lions that could take down a horse, rattlesnakes hidden in the tall grass, bands of displaced Cheyenne warriors angry about the encroachment on their lands, though the wagon master had insisted those fears were exaggerated. And worse, far worse, the kind of men who preyed on the vulnerable in lawless territory. The sun was already beginning its descent toward the western horizon, turning the sky a brilliant gold that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. In a few hours, that beauty would become darkness, and Clara would be completely exposed. She opened the trunk, taking inventory of her meager possessions. 2 dresses, both impractical for wilderness survival. A worn Bible her mother had given her. A small sewing kit. The parcel of biscuits, probably enough for 2 days if she rationed carefully. A thin blanket. A tintype photograph of her parents, their faces serious in that way people always looked in photographs, as if they'd known tragedy was coming. No flint for fire, no knife, no canteen. She was going to die out here. The thought came clearly, almost calmly, and Clara found herself sitting down hard on the trunk as her legs gave out. This was really happening. Her own blood relatives had sentenced her to death rather than let her choose her own future. A sob built in her chest, but she forced it down. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction, even if they weren't here to see it. She wouldn't die crying. Instead, she stood again, this time with grim determination. If these were to be her final hours, she would face them with dignity. She would walk as far as she could toward those distant mountains. Maybe she'd find water. Maybe she'd find shelter. Maybe... The sound of hoofbeats stopped her heart. Clara spun around, her pulse hammering in her ears. A rider was approaching from the north, moving at an easy canter across the grassland. For a wild moment, hope surged through her. Perhaps someone from the wagon train had convinced the others to come back. Perhaps her uncle had found some shred of conscience. But as the figure drew closer, she realized this was no one from the train. The rider was tall, sitting easy in the saddle with the natural grace of someone who'd spent more time on horseback than on foot. He wore dark trousers and a dusty shirt, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the sun. A rifle was slung across his back, and Clara could see the glint of a pistol at his hip. Her brief spark of hope transformed instantly into fear. She was alone, defenseless, and a strange man with guns was riding straight toward her. Every warning she'd ever heard about the frontier screamed in her mind. She looked around desperately for somewhere to run, somewhere to hide. But there was nothing, just open prairie in every direction. The rider slowed as he approached, pulling his horse to a stop about 20 feet away. For a long moment, he simply sat there, studying her with an expression she couldn't read beneath the shadow of his hat. Then he spoke, his voice low and rough, like gravel smoothed by river water. "You're a long way from anywhere, miss." Clara lifted her chin, trying to keep the terror out of her voice. I'm waiting for my party. They'll be back any moment." It was a transparent lie, and they both knew it. The man's eyes, she could see them now, a startling shade of gray-blue, flicked to the wagon tracks heading west, then to her broken trunk, then back to her face. "No, they won't." Two words spoken with absolute certainty, and Clara felt what remained of her composure begin to crack. He was right. Of course he was right. But admitting it meant accepting the full horror of her situation. "You don't know that," she said, but her voice wavered. The man swung down from his horse with fluid ease, and Clara took an involuntary step backward. He noticed and stopped, holding his hands slightly away from his sides in a gesture that might have been meant to be reassuring. "Easy," he said, in the same tone she'd heard men use with skittish horses. "I'm not going to hurt you. Name's Ethan Cole. I'm a scout, heading back from a surveying job up north." Clara stared at him, trying to reconcile the weapons he carried with the gentleness in his voice. Up close, she could see he was younger than she'd first thought, maybe 30 at most. His face was weathered by sun and wind, marked by a thin scar along his left jawline, but his eyes were clear and surprisingly kind. "Clara Whitmore," she heard herself say, then immediately regretted it. Why was she giving her name to a stranger? "Miss Whitmore." Ethan touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that seemed oddly formal, given the circumstances. "I don't mean to pry, but I've been tracking that wagon train for the last day. They're moving fast, and they're not coming back this way. So I'll ask you straight. Are you lost, or did they leave you here on purpose?" The directness of the question hit Clara like a physical blow. She opened her mouth to lie again, to maintain some pretense of dignity, but what came out instead was the truth. "On purpose," she whispered. "They left me on purpose." Something flickered across Ethan's face. Anger, maybe, or disgust, but his voice remained steady. "Why?" "I refused to marry a man they'd chosen for me." The words tasted bitter. "My uncle said I was ungrateful. My aunt said I'd brought it on myself." Ethan was quiet for a moment, his jaw tightening. When he spoke again, his voice was harder. "That's about the lowest thing I've heard in a long while, and I've heard some low things." Clara felt tears prickling at her eyes and blinked them back furiously. She would not cry, not now, not in front of this stranger who was probably just passing through, who would leave her here just like everyone else had. "Are you going to help me or not?" The words came out sharper than she intended, edged with fear and desperation. Ethan looked at her for a long moment, then at the setting sun, then back at her. "Sun's going down in about 3 hours. We've got maybe 40 miles to the nearest town. That's Pueblo, south and west of here. Even riding hard, we couldn't make it before full dark, and traveling this country at night is asking for trouble." "So you're leaving?" Clara felt something inside her go numb. Of course he was leaving. Why would he risk himself for a stranger? Didn't say that. Ethan walked back to his horse and began pulling supplies from his saddlebags. I'm saying we need to make camp for the night, then ride out at first light. We can make Pueblo by tomorrow afternoon if we start early. We? Clara stared at him, not quite believing what she was hearing. Ethan glanced up from his work, and for the first time, something that might have been a smile touched his eyes. You got a better plan, Miss Whitmore? No, I don't. Clara felt dizzy with sudden relief. But why? Why would you help me? He was quiet for a moment, his hand stilling on the rope he'd been uncoiling. When he spoke, his voice was distant, as if he were seeing something far away. Let's just say I know what it's like when the people who should protect you do the opposite. Nobody deserves to be left out here to die, especially not for standing up for themselves. There was a story there, Clara could tell, pain beneath those simple words, but she didn't pry. Instead, she watched as he efficiently set up a simple camp, his movements practiced and sure. He had a bedroll, a small canvas tarp, flint and steel, jerky and hardtack in his saddlebags, and most precious of all, a full canteen of water. We'll need to gather buffalo chips for the fire before it gets too dark, he said, scanning the prairie, and we'll want to set up in that depression over there, keep us out of sight from the trail. Buffalo chips? Clara asked, then felt foolish when understanding dawned. Of course, there were no trees out here, but there was plenty of dried buffalo dung that would burn well enough. If someone had told her a week ago that she'd be gathering animal droppings for a campfire with a strange man on the Colorado plains, she would have thought them mad. But here she was, following Ethan Cole through the grass, trying not to think too hard about what she was collecting in the fold of her skirt. As they worked, the sun continued its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson that seemed almost violent in their intensity. Claire kept glancing at Ethan, trying to figure him out. He moved with the quiet efficiency of someone completely at home in this harsh land, yet there was a gentleness in the way he'd spoken to her, a respect that her own family had never shown. You said you're a scout, she ventured as they carried their fuel back to camp. What does that mean exactly? Means I hire out to survey companies, army patrols, wagon trains sometimes. Anyone who needs someone to read the land, find water, avoid trouble. He knelt and began arranging the buffalo chips in a small pit he'd dug. Used to be in the cavalry, learned the trade there. Why did you leave? His hands paused for just a fraction of a second. Wasn't for me anymore. The things they asked us to do. He shook his head. I'm better on my own. Clara heard the finality in his tone and changed the subject. How did you know the wagon train wasn't coming back for me? Ethan struck the flint, sending sparks into the small nest of dried grass he'd prepared. I didn't, not for certain, but I saw them move through yesterday, and I saw them again today moving just as fast. Nobody stops in this stretch. There's no water, no reason to camp. When I saw you standing here with that trunk, it didn't take much figuring. The fire caught, small flames licking upward through the fuel. In the gathering dusk, that tiny circle of light felt like the only safe place in the world. Thank you, Clara said quietly. For stopping, for helping. I don't know how I can ever repay you. Ethan looked up from the fire, his face half in shadow. Don't need repaying, just need you to trust me enough to get us both to Pueblo alive. Think you can do that? Could she? Clara studied the man across the fire. A stranger with guns and a mysterious past who'd appeared out of nowhere and was now her only hope of survival. Everything in her upbringing screamed that this was dangerous, improper, potentially disastrous. A young woman alone with a man she didn't know, miles from civilization. But what choice did she have? And more than that, what did she feel when she looked at Ethan Cole? Not the fear she'd felt for Raymond Butcher, whose eyes had crawled over her like insects. Not the calculation she'd seen in her uncle's face when he'd arranged the marriage. Something different. Something that might, in time, become trust. Yes, she said. I can do that. As night fell over the prairie, they sat on opposite sides of the small fire, sharing jerky and hardtack that tasted like leather but filled the gnawing emptiness in Clara's stomach. Ethan gave her most of the water, waving off her protests. I know where we'll find more tomorrow. You don't. Drink. The stars emerged one by one, Then all at once, millions of them scattered across the black dome of sky with a brilliance Clara had never seen back in St. Louis. Out here, away from city lights, the Milky Way was a river of light overhead. "It's beautiful," she murmured, then felt foolish for stating the obvious. But Ethan nodded, his eyes on the stars. "It is. One of the few things about this life I'd never trade. The cities, the settlements, they're getting bigger every year. But out here, at least for now, you can still see what the world looked like before we got our hands on it." "Do you like being alone?" The question slipped out before Clara could stop it. Ethan was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally he said, "I did. For a while it seemed easier, simpler. Nobody to disappoint, nobody to lose." He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling upward. "But lately I'm not so sure. Gets cold sometimes, even in summer." Clara understood that loneliness, had felt it in her uncle's house despite being surrounded by family. "I wanted to be a teacher," she said suddenly. "That's what I told them. That's why I wouldn't marry Mr. Butcher. He wanted a wife to cook and clean and bear children, and when I said I wanted to teach, he laughed, said no wife of his would work." "You'd make a good teacher," Ethan said. "You don't know that. You just met me." "Maybe. But you're standing here right now instead of crying or giving up. That takes strength. And you speak well, ask questions, want to understand things. Those are good qualities in a teacher." The simple validation, coming from this quiet stranger, meant more than Clara could express. She felt something loosening in her chest, some tight knot of fear and anger beginning to unravel. "What about you?" she asked. "What do you want?" Ethan smiled, a real smile this time, though there was sadness in it. "Honestly, I don't know anymore. Used to think I wanted to wander forever, see everything there was to see. But there's only so many horizons a man can chase before they all start looking the same." They fell into comfortable silence after that, the fire crackling between them. Ethan had spread his bedroll on one side of the tarp and insisted Clara take the other side with her thin blanket. It wasn't much, but it was more than she'd had hours ago. "Get some sleep," he said, settling down with his rifle across his lap. "I'll take first watch." "Watch for what?" Clara asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. "Hopefully nothing, but out here, you don't take chances." Clara lay down, pulling her blanket around her shoulders, and stared up at the stars. She should have been terrified, and part of her was, but another part felt something unexpected, hope. She was alive. She wasn't alone. And tomorrow she would reach Pueblo and begin figuring out what came next. As exhaustion finally pulled her toward sleep, she heard Ethan's voice, soft in the darkness. "You did the right thing, you know, saying no to that marriage. Don't ever think otherwise." "How can you be sure?" Clara murmured, already half dreaming. "Because you're here and you're free. That's worth more than any security they could have offered you." Clara fell asleep with those words wrapped around her like a second blanket, and for the first time in months, she didn't dream of being trapped. She woke to the sound of movement and the smell of coffee. For a disoriented moment, Clara couldn't remember where she was. Then everything came rushing back. The abandonment, Ethan, the camp. She sat up quickly, her body aching from sleeping on the hard ground, and found Ethan crouched by the fire, brewing coffee in a small tin pot. The sun was just breaking over the eastern horizon, painting the prairie in shades of rose and gold. The morning air was crisp, almost cold, and Clara's breath misted in front of her face. "Morning," Ethan said, not looking up from his work. "Coffee's almost ready. We should eat quick and ride out. Want to make good time before the heat sets in." Clara nodded, finger-combing her hair and trying to make herself presentable. A futile effort, she knew, but old habits died hard. When Ethan handed her a tin cup of coffee, she wrapped her cold hands around it gratefully. "Drink it all," he said. "We'll find water by midday." They ate more jerky and hardtack, packed up the simple camp, and were ready to ride as the sun fully cleared the horizon. That's when Clara realized the practical problem with their arrangement. "Your horse," she said, looking at the single mount. "How are we both—" "You'll ride in front of me," Ethan said matter-of-factly. "It's not ideal for the horse, but Buck's strong and we'll take it easy. We'll switch to walking every few hours to give him a break." The thought of sitting in front of Ethan, practically in his arms for hours, made Clara's cheeks burn. But what choice did she have? She nodded, trying to look more confident than she felt. Ethan mounted first, then extended his hand down to her. "Put your foot on mine and I'll pull you up." It was awkward and ungainly, and Clara was certain she looked ridiculous, but somehow she ended up seated in front of Ethan on the saddle, his arms coming around either side of her to hold the reins. She could feel the solid warmth of him at her back, smell the scent of wood smoke and leather, and something else, something clean despite the days of travel. "You all right?" he asked, his voice close to her ear. Clara swallowed hard. "Yes, fine. It's a long ride. If you need to stop, just say so." And then they were moving, Buck stepping carefully at first, then settling into an easy walk that carried them southwest across the prairie. The morning was beautiful in a spare, harsh way, the endless grass rippling in the breeze, the distant mountains growing slowly closer, the sky so vast it seemed to swallow everything. For the first hour, they rode in silence. Clara was intensely aware of every point of contact between them, Ethan's arms bracketing her sides, the gentle movement of his breathing, the way he shifted slightly in the saddle to keep balance. It should have felt improper, scandalous. Instead, it felt safe. "Tell me about St. Louis," Ethan said eventually. "What was it like?" Grateful for the distraction, Clara began to talk. She told him about the city, the bustle of the riverfront, the schools where she'd dreamed of teaching. She told him about her parents, how her father had been a clerk and her mother had taken in sewing, how they'd been planning to move west for better opportunities when the cholera outbreak struck. "I was 16, she said quietly, "old enough to understand that I was losing them, young enough to feel like the world was ending. My uncle was my father's brother, and he seemed kind at first. It was only later that I understood the cost of his kindness." Ethan listened without interrupting, his presence steady at her back. When she finished, he said, "My parents died when I was 12. Different circumstances, fever, not cholera, but I remember that feeling, like the ground had disappeared beneath your feet. Is that why you joined the cavalry?" "Partly. Orphan boy without prospects, the army seemed like a good option. They'd feed you, train you, give you a purpose." His voice went flat. Took me a few years to understand what that purpose really meant. Clara wanted to ask more, but something in his tone warned her off. Instead, she said, "What will you do after Pueblo? After we get there?" "Haven't decided yet. I've got some money saved from the surveying job. Might take a few weeks, figure out my next move." He paused. "What about you? What will you do?" It was the question Clara had been avoiding thinking about, the terrifying reality that waited at the end of this ride. She had no money, no connections, no plan beyond reaching safety. "I don't know," she admitted. "Find work, I suppose. Maybe as a domestic or in a shop. I can read and write and do figures. That must be worth something." "You said you wanted to teach." "Yes, but that requires references, certification. I have none of those things." "Pueblo's growing fast," Ethan said thoughtfully. "A lot of families moving in, a lot of children who need schooling. They might not be as particular about credentials as you think." The suggestion sent a small flare of hope through Clara's chest, but she tried not to let it grow too bright. Hope was dangerous. Hope led to disappointment. Around mid-morning, they stopped to rest Buck and let him drink from a small creek that cut through the prairie. Ethan had led them straight to it, reading the land in ways Clara couldn't understand. They walked for an hour, leading the horse, and Clara discovered that the riding muscles she'd developed over 3 months of wagon travel had not prepared her for this kind of saddle work. "Sore?" Ethan asked, noting her grimace. "I'll survive. We can take longer breaks if you need." "No." Clara shook her head firmly. "The sooner we reach Pueblo, the better. I can handle a little discomfort." Something that might have been approval flickered across Ethan's face. "All right then, but let me know if it gets too bad. Being too proud to speak up out here can get you killed." It was a harsh truth, delivered matter-of-factly, and Clara filed it away. This was a different world than the one she'd known in St. Louis. Different rules, different dangers. They mounted again and continued riding. The sun climbed higher, turning the air hot and dry. Clara's dress clung uncomfortably to her back, and she was grateful for Ethan's wide-brimmed hat that provided some shade. He'd insisted she wear it, leaving his own head bare under the brutal sun. "I used to be cavalry," he said. "I can take it." As the day wore on, they talked more. Ethan told her about tracking, how to read signs in the landscape, broken grass, disturbed earth, the way birds behaved when predators were near. Clara, in turn, told him about books she'd read, stories she loved, the feel of chalk in her hand when she'd practiced writing on a slate board. "My mother taught me to read," she said. "We couldn't afford many books, but she'd borrow them from a lending library, and we'd read together by candlelight. She had the most beautiful reading voice." "What kind of stories did you like best?" Clara smiled, remembering. "Adventures. Stories about people who went on journeys and found themselves changed. I used to think they were just fantasies." She paused. "I don't think that anymore." "Because you're living one?" "Because I'm learning that change isn't always something you choose. Sometimes it's something that happens to you, and you either grow from it or you break." Ethan was quiet for a moment, then, "You're not going to break, Clara Whitmore. I can tell." The use of her first name sent a small, unexpected warmth through her. When had he stopped calling her Miss Whitmore? When had it started feeling natural? It was mid-afternoon when everything changed. They'd stopped again to rest Buck and were preparing to remount when Ethan suddenly went still, his eyes fixed on something in the distance. Clara followed his gaze and saw what he'd seen, a group of riders, maybe 5 or 6 of them, moving parallel to their position about a mile away. "Is that normal?" she asked. "Other travelers?" But Ethan's expression had gone hard, his hand moving instinctively to the pistol at his hip. "No, not like that. Not the way they're moving." "What do you mean?" "They're tracking something." He studied the riders for another moment, then cursed softly under his breath. "They're tracking us." Clara's heart lurched. "How can you tell?" "See how they're spread out? That's a hunting formation, and the way they keep checking the ground, they're following our trail." Ethan was already moving, helping Clara quickly onto Buck and mounting behind her. "We need to move, now." "Who are they?" But even as she asked, Clara saw Ethan's jaw tighten in a way that told her he knew exactly who they were. And from the fear she saw flicker briefly in his eyes, real fear, the first she'd seen from him, she understood that whoever these men were, they were dangerous. "Trouble from my past," Ethan said grimly, urging Buck into a faster pace. "Trouble I thought I'd left behind." "What kind of trouble?" "The kind that doesn't forgive and doesn't forget." They rode hard then, Buck's hooves pounding across the prairie as Ethan pushed the horse faster than they'd gone all day. Clara clung to the saddle, fear rising in her throat. Behind them, the group of riders had changed direction. They were definitely following, and they were getting closer. The mountains that had seemed so distant that morning now loomed larger on the horizon, dark shapes against the bright sky. Somewhere ahead was Pueblo, safety, civilization. But between here and there was nothing but open prairie, and 6 men with guns who were hunting them across the Colorado plains. Clara felt Ethan's arms tighten around her as he urged Buck to an even faster gallop, and she understood with sudden, terrible clarity that the danger she'd faced when her family abandoned her was nothing compared to what was coming now. The real test was just beginning. Buck's breathing came in ragged gasps as Ethan pushed him across a shallow ravine, water splashing up from the creek bed. Clara gripped the saddle horn so tightly her knuckles had gone white, her heart hammering against her ribs as she risked a glance backward. The riders were closer now, close enough that she could make out individual figures against the prairie grass. Close enough to see the dust cloud their horses kicked up. Close enough to feel the weight of their pursuit like a physical thing pressing against her spine. "Don't look back," Ethan said sharply, his voice tight with something that might have been fear or anger or both. "Just hold on." They burst out of the ravine and onto higher ground, and for a moment Clara thought they might outrun their pursuers. But Buck stumbled slightly, his exhaustion becoming impossible to ignore, and she felt Ethan's body tense behind her. "He can't keep this up much longer," Ethan muttered, more to himself than to her. His eyes scanned the landscape ahead with desperate intensity, looking for something, shelter, cover, anything that might give them an advantage. "Who are they?" Clara asked again, her voice shaking. "Jack Reeves and his gang." The name came out like a curse. "We served together in the cavalry, back before he deserted and decided running with outlaws paid better than serving the government. What does he want with you? Ethan was quiet for a moment, guiding Buck around a cluster of rocks. When he spoke, his voice was low and hard. There was a payroll robbery 2 years ago. I was scouting for the cavalry patrol that tracked them down. We recovered most of the money, but Jack got away. He's blamed me ever since for the deaths of 3 of his men and the fact that he's been running ever since. 2 years, Clara breathed. He's been hunting you for 2 years? Men like Jack don't forget, and they don't forgive. Ethan pulled Buck to a sudden halt, his eyes fixed on something ahead. There! You see that canyon entrance? Clara followed his gaze and saw a narrow cleft in the rising landscape ahead, a dark slash between 2 rock walls. Yes. We're going to make for that. If we can get into the canyon system, the terrain might give us an advantage. They can't spread out in there, can't surround us. And if it's a dead end? Ethan's silence was answer enough. They rode hard for the canyon entrance, Buck giving everything he had left despite his exhaustion. Behind them, Clara heard a shout. One of the riders had spotted them changing direction. More shouts followed, and then something that made her blood run cold. A gunshot. The bullet didn't come close, but it didn't need to. It was a message, a promise of what was coming. Almost there, Ethan said, his voice steady despite everything. Just hold on, Clara. Hold on. They plunged into the canyon entrance, the rock walls rising suddenly on either side like the jaws of some great beast. The temperature dropped immediately, the stone providing blessed shade from the brutal afternoon sun. Buck's hooves clattered on stone instead of grass, the sound echoing strangely in the enclosed space. Ethan didn't slow down. He urged Buck deeper into the canyon, taking turns without hesitation, reading the landscape in ways Clara couldn't begin to understand. Left, then right, then left again, the passages narrowing and widening in irregular patterns. How do you know where you're going? Clara asked. I don't, but neither do they. It was small comfort, but it was something. The canyon system was a maze of stone and shadow, passages branching off in multiple directions, some climbing upward, others descending into darkness. Every few hundred yards, Ethan would pause, listening, then choose a direction and move on. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, he finally pulled Buck to a stop in a wider section of canyon where a small trickle of water ran down one wall, creating a shallow pool. He dismounted quickly, helping Clara down, and immediately began checking Buck over. Is he all right? Clara asked, watching the horse's labored breathing with concern. He's exhausted. We pushed him too hard. Ethan's hands moved expertly over Buck's legs, checking for injury. But he'll recover. We'll need to rest here for a bit, let him drink and catch his breath. Can we afford to stop? Ethan looked at her, and Clara saw the calculation in his eyes, weighing their options, measuring risks. We can't afford not to. If Buck goes down, we're on foot, and that's a death sentence. He was right, of course. Clara watched as he led Buck to the pool, letting the horse drink while he pulled his rifle from its scabbard and checked the ammunition. The casual competence of his movements did nothing to hide the tension in his shoulders. How many bullets do you have? The question slipped out before Clara could stop it. Enough. Ethan didn't look up from his work. Hopefully more than enough. Clara wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warm air. The reality of their situation was setting in now that they'd stopped moving. 6 armed men were hunting them through this maze of stone, men who wanted Ethan dead and who probably wouldn't think twice about killing her too if she got in the way. I'm sorry, she said quietly. Ethan looked up, genuine surprise on his face. For what? For being here. For slowing you down. If you were alone, you could probably... Don't. The word came out sharp, almost angry. Ethan set down the rifle and crossed to where she stood, his gray-blue eyes intense. Don't apologize for being in danger that you didn't ask for and didn't cause. Jack Reeves and his men are here because of choices I made 2 years ago. You're here because your family betrayed you. None of this is your fault. Clara felt tears prickling at her eyes and blinked them back furiously. I'm scared. Good. So am I. Ethan's honesty surprised her. Fear keeps you sharp, keeps you alive. It's when you stop being scared that you make mistakes. A sound echoed through the canyon, distant voices, the clatter of hooves on stone. They both froze, listening. The sounds were coming from somewhere behind them, back the way they'd come, but the canyon's acoustics made it impossible to judge exactly how far. "We need to keep moving," Ethan said, already turning back to Buck. "Just a few more minutes of rest, then we go deeper." They waited in tense silence, giving Buck time to recover while listening to the sounds of pursuit echo through the stone passages. Clara found herself studying Ethan's profile, the way he stood with easy readiness, rifle in hand, eyes constantly scanning. This was a different man than the one who gently shared his coffee that morning. This was the cavalry scout, the tracker, the survivor. "Why did you really leave the army?" she asked suddenly. Ethan glanced at her, something unreadable crossing his face. "You sure you want to know?" "We might die in this canyon. I'd like to know more about the man I'm dying with." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Fair enough." He was quiet for a moment, choosing his words. "There was a village, Cheyenne. We'd been tracking a group of warriors who'd attacked a settler family. The trail led us to this village, and the commanding officer ordered us to make an example." Clara felt her stomach tighten. She'd heard stories, whispers about what happened in conflicts with the native tribes, but she'd never heard them from someone who'd been there. "I wouldn't do it," Ethan continued, his voice flat. "Neither would a few other men. We refused the order. They called it insubordination, nearly court-martialed us. In the end, they let us go with dishonorable discharges rather than make it a bigger scandal." He looked at her directly. "I chose to leave rather than become the kind of man who could do what they asked. Some choices are easy, even when the consequences are hard." Clara understood then why he'd stopped for her on the prairie, why he'd risked himself for a stranger. It wasn't just kindness, it was principle, a line he'd drawn and refused to cross no matter the cost. "I'm glad you made that choice," she said softly. "So am I. Most days." Ethan checked Buck one more time, then nodded. "All right, we need to move. Stay close to me, watch your footing, and if I tell you to run, you run. Understand? What about you?" "I'll be right behind you." It was probably a lie, but Clara appreciated it anyway. They moved deeper into the canyon system, leading Buck rather than riding him, picking their way over loose stones and around tight corners. The passages grew narrower, the walls rising higher on either side until only a sliver of sky was visible above them. Claire's dress caught on rough stone, and she heard fabric tear, but she didn't stop to check the damage. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit continued, sometimes close, sometimes distant, the echoes playing tricks with perception. Once Clara could have sworn she heard voices just around the next bend, but when they turned the corner, there was nothing but empty stone and shadow. "They're splitting up," Ethan said quietly, his tracking skills reading signs Clara couldn't see. "Trying to cover more ground, cut off escape routes." "Is there an escape route?" "There's always an escape route. You just have to find it before they find you." They came to a fork in the canyon, 3 passages branching off in different directions. Ethan studied each one, his eyes moving over the ground, the walls, the angle of the shadows. Finally, he pointed to the middle passage. "That one. It's climbing upward. Might lead us out of the canyon system entirely." They'd only gone 20 yards down the passage when they heard the shout behind them. Clara's heart lurched into her throat as she turned and saw a figure silhouetted at the fork they'd just left. One of Jack's men, rifle already rising to his shoulder. "Run!" Ethan shoved Clara forward even as he spun, his own rifle coming up. The sound of gunfire in the enclosed space was deafening. Clara stumbled forward, half dragging Buck, her ears ringing as shots echoed off the stone walls. She heard Ethan fire twice, heard a cry that might have been pain or surprise, but she didn't dare look back. The passage climbed steeply upward, and Clara's lungs burned as she scrambled over loose rock, her skirts tangling around her legs. Buck's hooves clattered behind her, and then Ethan was there, grabbing her arm and pulling her forward with desperate strength. "Keep going! Don't stop!" More shouts echoed from below. More gunfire, but the angle of the passage meant the bullets ricocheted harmlessly off stone. They burst out of the narrow passage into a wider area, a natural amphitheater of sorts, with rock walls rising on 3 sides, and a slope of scree leading upward on the 4th. "Up," Ethan said, already moving toward the slope. "If we can get to higher ground—" He never finished the sentence. 3 riders appeared at the top of the scree slope, blocking their escape route. Clara recognized the man in the center immediately, though she'd never seen him before. There was something in the way he sat his horse, the cruel intelligence in his eyes, that marked him as the leader. Jack Reeves. "Well, well," Jack said, his voice carrying easily across the amphitheater. "Ethan Cole. Been a long time, friend." "We're not friends, Jack." Ethan's voice was steady, but Clara could feel the tension radiating off him. "Never were." "No?" Jack smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Funny, I seem to remember us riding together, fighting together, bleeding together, back before you decided to play hero and ruin everything." 2 more riders appeared from the passage Clara and Ethan had just exited, cutting off their retreat. 5 men now, with guns trained on them from multiple directions. The 6th, Clara assumed, was the one Ethan had shot in the narrow passage. "You brought this on yourself," Ethan said. "You deserted, you killed innocent people, you stole Army payroll. I just did my job." "Your job." Jack's smile faded. "Your job got 3 of my men killed and put me on the run for 2 years. 2 years, Ethan, 2 years of looking over my shoulder, sleeping with one eye open, never able to settle anywhere." He leaned forward in his saddle. "You owe me for that, and I aim to collect." Clara felt Ethan's hand find hers, squeezing once. A message, though she didn't know what it meant. His rifle was still in his other hand, but pointed at the ground. Raising it would be suicide with this many guns trained on them. "Let the woman go," Ethan said. "She's not part of this." Jack's eyes shifted to Clara for the first time, and she fought the urge to shrink back from his gaze. "Pretty thing. Where'd you pick her up?" "She's nobody. Just a traveler I was helping get to Pueblo. Let her walk away, and you can do whatever you want with me." "Ethan," Clara started, but he squeezed her hand again, harder this time. Jack appeared to consider this, then shook his head. "Can't do that. See, she's seen our faces now, seen what's happening. That makes her a witness, and witnesses have a way of causing problems down the road." "She won't say anything. Will you, Clara?" Clara's mouth had gone dry, but she managed to shake her head. "No, I won't. I promise." "Promises," Jack said, almost sadly. "Hell, I used to believe in promises. Used to believe in a lot of things." He straightened in his saddle. "But I learned better. The only thing you can trust in this world is what you can control." One of the other riders, a thin man with a scar across his nose, leaned over and whispered something to Jack. Jack nodded, then looked back at Ethan with renewed interest. "Garrett here tells me you only shot Tommy in the leg. Not dead, just wounded. That's interesting, Ethan. 2 years ago you helped kill 3 of my men without blinking. Today, you had a clear shot and you aimed low." Jack tilted his head. "You going soft? Or is it the woman making you hesitate?" Ethan said nothing, but Clara felt his hand tighten on hers. "I think it's the woman," Jack continued. "I think she matters to you, which is unfortunate, because it gives me leverage." "Jack!" Ethan's voice held a warning, but Jack cut him off. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to put down that rifle nice and slow. Then you're going to tell me where you stashed the rest of that payroll money. The part that was never recovered. There is no money. The Army got it all back." "Liar." Jack's voice went cold. "We had $30,000 when you and your patrol caught up to us. The Army reported recovering $22,000. That leaves $8,000 unaccounted for. And I know you, Ethan. I know how you think. You took it, figured you'd earned it for your tracking work, and now you're going to tell me where it is." Clara looked at Ethan, searching his face for truth. Had he taken the money? Was that why he'd left the Army? Why he'd been wandering alone? But Ethan met her gaze steadily, and she saw only honesty there. "I didn't take it, Jack. Whatever happened to that money, it wasn't me." "Then someone in your patrol took it." "Who? Give me a name and maybe I'll let you both walk away from this." "I can't give you what I don't have." Jack stared at him for a long moment, then sighed. "Wrong answer." He raised his pistol, aiming it directly at Clara's chest. "Last chance, Ethan. The money, or I shoot her." Time seemed to slow down. Clara felt every beat of her heart, heard every breath, saw the hammer of Jack's pistol pull back with terrible clarity. She waited for fear to overwhelm her, but instead she felt oddly calm. If these were to be her final moments, at least they would be on her own terms. At least she would die standing beside someone who'd shown her more kindness in 2 days than her own family had in years. All right, Ethan's voice cut through the silence. All right, I'll tell you. Ethan, no, Clara started, but he was already speaking. It's buried. 3 days' ride north of here, near the old cavalry outpost at Red Creek Canyon, 20 paces due west from the flagpole, buried 3 feet down. Jack studied him, weighing the truth of it. You better not be lying to me. I'm not. Let her go, and I'll draw you a map, tell you exactly where to find it. Claire's mind raced. Was he telling the truth? Or was this a desperate gamble, buying time with a lie? She couldn't tell. And from the look on Jack's face, neither could he. Billy, Jack said, not taking his eyes off Ethan. Tie them up, both of them. We'll camp here tonight, head north in the morning. If the money's where he says it is, maybe we'll let them live. If it's not, he smiled that cold smile again. Well, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. The thin man, Billy, dismounted and approached them with a length of rope. Ethan set down his rifle slowly, and Clara saw the defeat in his shoulders. They'd gambled and lost. Or had they? As Billy reached for Ethan's hands, Clara saw something flicker in Ethan's eyes. A signal, a warning, and then everything happened at once. Ethan grabbed Billy's outstretched arm and pulled hard, using the man's momentum to throw him off balance. At the same time, he shoved Clara backward, hard enough to send her stumbling toward the rock wall. Get down! Gunfire erupted. Clara hit the ground hard, stones digging into her palms as she scrambled for cover. Above her she heard shouts, the thunder of hooves, more shots. She pressed herself against the rock wall, making herself as small as possible, and watched in horror as chaos unfolded. Ethan had Billy's gun now, must have taken it during the struggle, and was firing even as he ran toward Buck. One of Jack's men went down, clutching his shoulder. Another's horse reared, spooked by the gunfire, throwing its rider. "Kill him!" Jack was shouting. "Kill them both!" But the amphitheater was working against them. With their men scattered around the perimeter, they couldn't shoot without risking hitting each other. It was the only thing keeping Ethan alive as he reached Buck and grabbed for his rifle, still tied to the saddle. Clara saw her chance. While everyone was focused on Ethan, she scrambled toward the narrow passage they'd entered through. If she could just reach it, could just get into the maze of canyons, she might be able to hide, might be able to... A hand grabbed her ankle. Clara screamed and kicked hard, her boot connecting with something soft. There was a grunt of pain, and the hand released her. She didn't look back, just kept scrambling forward. She made it 5 feet into the passage before someone tackled her from behind, driving her face first into the rocky ground. Pain exploded through her jaw, and she tasted blood. "Got her!" It was Billy's voice, rough with anger. Strong hands yanked her to her feet, and Clara found herself staring into Billy's scarred face. His nose was bleeding, from her kick, she realized, with grim satisfaction. "Little wildcat," he snarled, dragging her back toward the amphitheater. The gunfire had stopped. An ominous silence had fallen, broken only by the sound of Clara's own ragged breathing. As Billy pulled her back into the open, she saw why. Jack had his pistol pressed against the back of Ethan's head. Ethan was on his knees, hands raised, his face expressionless. But his eyes found Clara's, and she saw the apology there, the regret. "Well now," Jack said conversationally. "That was exciting. But it's over now, Ethan. You've killed one of my men and wounded another. That makes the debt even bigger than it was before." "Let her go," Ethan said again, his voice steady despite the gun at his skull. "Please, Jack, she's innocent in all of this." "Nobody's innocent." Jack looked at Billy. "Tie them both up, real tight this time, and gag them. I'm tired of hearing them talk." Billy shoved Clara down next to Ethan and began wrapping rope around her wrists, yanking it tight enough to cut into her skin. She bit back a cry of pain, refusing to give him the satisfaction. Beside her, Ethan was similarly bound, his hands behind his back, another length of rope securing his ankles. When Billy pulled a dirty cloth from his pocket to use as a gag, Ethan spoke quickly. "Clara, listen to me. Whatever happens..." The gag cut off his words, but Clara heard what he'd been trying to say anyway. She saw it in his eyes, in the set of his jaw. He was preparing to die, preparing to sacrifice himself if it meant she might have a chance. Her own gag followed, the cloth tasting of dust and tobacco, making her want to retch. Billy dragged them both to the base of the rock wall and left them there, bound and helpless. Night was falling. The sun had dipped below the canyon rim, leaving them in shadow, while the sky above still glowed with fading light. Jack's remaining men were setting up camp, building a fire, tending to their wounded. The man Ethan had shot in the shoulder would probably survive. The one he'd shot in the passage, Tommy, was being bandaged, cursing steadily. Jack himself sat by the fire, cleaning his pistol with methodical care. Every so often, he would look over at where Clara and Ethan sat bound against the wall, his expression thoughtful. Clara tested the ropes binding her wrists, but Billy knew his knots. There was no give, no slack. Her jaw throbbed where she'd hit the ground, and her wrists burned where the rope cut into them, but physical pain was the least of her concerns. They were going to die here. She understood that now with terrible clarity. Even if there really was money buried at Red Creek Canyon, Jack would never let them live. They knew too much, had seen too much. And after what had happened in the amphitheater, after Ethan had killed one of his men, mercy was off the table entirely. She looked at Ethan, wanting to communicate something. Gratitude, maybe, or solidarity, or just a simple acknowledgement that they'd tried. But his eyes were closed. For a moment, Clara thought he might be praying, but then she noticed the way he was moving his hands slightly, working at the ropes with patient determination. He was trying to escape. Clara's heart leapt with sudden, fragile hope. She began working at her own bonds, trying to mimic what she'd seen Ethan doing, but the rope was too tight and her hands were too small. All she managed to do was make her wrists bleed. The stars came out, the same brilliant display she'd seen the night before when she and Ethan had camped on the prairie. It seemed impossible that only 24 hours had passed. It seemed like another lifetime entirely. Jack stood and walked over to them, his boots crunching on stone. He pulled the gag from Ethan's mouth, but left Clara's in place. "Last chance," he said quietly. "Real truth this time. Is there money at Red Creek, or were you lying to buy time?" Ethan met his gaze steadily. "There's money there. I don't know if it's from the payroll. Like I said, I didn't take it. But there's a cache buried where I told you. Supply depot from my cavalry days. Some gold, some cash, supplies. Enough to make the trip worthwhile." It was a lie. Clara could tell from the subtle shift in Ethan's expression, the way he held Jack's gaze just a fraction too long. There was no cash, no buried money. He was gambling everything on one last desperate bluff. Jack stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "We'll see. Morning comes, we ride north. You're coming with us, and if that money's not there, I'm going to make you watch while Billy here does things to your lady friend that'll make her wish she'd died on that prairie." The casual cruelty of the threat made Clara's stomach turn. Ethan's face went white with rage. "You touch her and I'll—" "You'll what?" Jack cut him off. "You're tied up, outnumbered, and about one smart comment away from getting a bullet in the head. You're in no position to make threats." He replaced the gag, cutting off whatever Ethan had been about to say, and walked back to the fire. The night wore on. The outlaws took turns keeping watch, but their discipline was lax. Too much whiskey passing around the fire. Too much confidence in their prisoner's helplessness. Clara watched through half-closed eyes, conserving her strength, still working uselessly at the ropes binding her wrists. Beside her, Ethan had gone very still. At first, Clara thought he might have given up, accepted their fate. But then she saw his eyes, alert and watchful, tracking every movement in the camp. He was waiting for something, planning something. The moon rose, nearly full, casting silver light across the canyon amphitheater. The fire burned down to embers. 3 of the outlaws were asleep, their snores echoing off the stone walls. Billy was supposed to be on watch, but his head kept nodding forward, jerking back up, nodding again. Ethan moved. Clara didn't see exactly what he did. The movement was too quick, too subtle. But suddenly his hands were in front of him instead of behind his back. The rope was still there, still binding his wrists together, but he had somehow slipped his hands through. He worked at the knot for a moment, his fingers moving with steady precision despite the awkward angle, and then his hands were free. He reached for Clara immediately, pulling the gag from her mouth first, then working on the ropes binding her wrists. His fingers brushed against her torn skin and she hissed in pain, but didn't pull away. "How did you?" she whispered. "Cavalry trick. Dislocate your thumb, slide your hands through, pop it back in." His voice was barely audible, his eyes never leaving the camp. "Hurts like hell, but it works." "Your thumb is dislocated?" "Already put it back. I'm fine." The ropes around her wrists fell away, and Ethan immediately moved to her ankles. "When I say run, you run. Don't wait for me. Don't look back. Head for that passage." He nodded toward a narrow cleft in the rock wall opposite from where they'd entered. "It leads up and out of the canyon. You get topside, you head south. Pueblo's maybe 15 miles. You can make it by tomorrow if you walk through the night." "What about you?" "I'll buy you time. Create a distraction." "No." Clara grabbed his arm. "We both go. Right now, while they're sleeping. If we both run, someone will wake up and they'll hunt us down. But if I make enough noise over here, you can slip away in the confusion." Clara understood what he was really saying. He was planning to sacrifice himself, to die fighting so she could escape, just like he'd been planning to do in the amphitheater before Jack had captured them both. "I'm not leaving you," she said firmly. "Clara, no. You said yourself there's always an escape route, so we find it. Together." Ethan stared at her for a moment, and Clara saw the conflict in his eyes, the ingrained instinct to protect warring with something else. Something that might have been respect or admiration, or the simple recognition that she meant what she said. "All right," he said finally, "but we do this my way. Slow and quiet. No heroics." "No heroics," Clara agreed. They moved together, keeping low, staying in the deepest shadows cast by the moonlight. Ethan led the way with the confidence of someone who'd done this kind of thing before, probably many times. They skirted the edge of the amphitheater, giving the sleeping outlaws a wide berth. They were almost to the passage Ethan had pointed out when Billy's head jerked up. His eyes widened as he saw them, and his mouth opened to shout. Ethan was faster. He crossed the distance in 3 long strides and hit Billy hard, his fist connecting with the man's jaw in a blow that sounded like a hammer striking wood. Billy went down without a sound, but the damage was done. The other outlaws were waking, shouting, reaching for weapons. "Run!" Ethan grabbed Clara's hand and pulled her toward the passage. Gunfire erupted behind them. Bullets ricocheted off stone, the sounds deafening in the enclosed space. Clara ducked instinctively but kept running, Ethan's hand tight around hers, pulling her forward into the narrow cleft. The passage was barely wide enough for them to run single file. Clara's shoulders brushed stone on both sides as they climbed upward, the floor slick with moisture and loose rock. Behind them, she could hear Jack's voice screaming orders, could hear the sound of pursuit. "Keep going," Ethan shouted. "Don't stop." The passage twisted and turned, climbing steadily. Clara's lungs burned and her legs screamed in protest, but she didn't slow down. Couldn't slow down. The alternative was unthinkable. They burst out of the passage onto a broad shelf of rock, and suddenly the whole canyon system was spread out below them, bathed in moonlight. But there was no time to appreciate the view. The passage behind them echoed with shouts and footsteps. "There!" Ethan pointed to a slope of loose scree leading upward to what looked like the canyon rim. "If we can reach the top—" A bullet struck the rock inches from Clara's head, spraying her face with stone fragments. She flinched and stumbled, and Ethan caught her, steadying her. "Almost there. Come on." They scrambled up the scree slope, stones sliding away beneath their feet, making every step a struggle. Clara's hands were bleeding again, torn by the sharp rocks, but she barely noticed. All that mattered was reaching the top, reaching safety. They were 10 feet from the rim when Jack Reeves emerged from the passage below, his face twisted with rage. "Stop!" he shouted, raising his pistol. Ethan pushed Clara ahead of him, putting his body between her and the gun. "Go! I'm right behind you!" Clara reached the rim and pulled herself over, then turned back to help Ethan. But he wasn't climbing anymore. He was standing on the scree slope, facing Jack, his hands raised. "Ethan, come on!" Clara reached down for him. "I'm going to count to 3, Jack said, his voice carrying clearly in the night air. "If you're not back down here by 3, I shoot. 1. Clara, run!" Ethan didn't turn around, didn't take his eyes off Jack. "Run now!" "No!" 2. "I'm not leaving you." Ethan finally looked up at her, and the expression on his face broke her heart. It was acceptance, resignation, and underneath it all, a fierce determination that she survive even if he didn't. "Please," he said quietly. "Please, Clara, run." And for the first time since this nightmare began, Clara did the one thing she'd sworn she wouldn't do. She ran. Clara ran blind, tears streaming down her face, the sound of gunfire echoing behind her. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to help Ethan, but his final plea kept her legs moving forward across the rocky ground. The moonlight turned the landscape into a nightmare of shadows and silver, every stone a potential hazard, every depression in the earth ready to twist an ankle or send her sprawling. She'd made it perhaps 200 yards when the shooting stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the gunfire had been. Clara stumbled to a halt, her chest heaving, and turned back toward the canyon rim. From this distance, she could see nothing but dark shapes against darker stone. No movement, no sound except the wind whistling across the open plateau. Was he dead? Had Jack killed him the moment she'd disappeared over the rim? Or had they taken him prisoner again, dragged him back down into the canyon to face whatever horrors they'd planned? Clara pressed her hands against her mouth, stifling a sob. She should have stayed, should have fought alongside him. They could have faced it together, whatever came. Instead, she'd run like a coward, leaving him to die alone. But he'd asked her to run, begged her to. And standing here wasn't helping anyone. Clara forced herself to move, to put one foot in front of the other, heading south the way Ethan had told her. Pueblo was 15 miles away. She could make it by morning if she walked through the night. She could get help, bring back the sheriff, mount a rescue. Even as she thought it, Clara knew it was a fantasy. By the time she reached Pueblo, by the time she found help and led them back here, it would be too late. Jack Reeves wasn't the kind of man to wait around. Still, she kept walking. What else could she do? The plateau stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by scattered outcroppings of rock and the occasional twisted juniper. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the human drama unfolding below. Clara had never felt so alone. Not even when the wagon train had abandoned her. At least then, Ethan had appeared. Now there was no one coming to save her. She'd been walking for perhaps an hour when she heard the sound of hoofbeats. Clara's heart seized in her chest. She spun around, searching the darkness for the source, but saw nothing at first. Then, moving between two rocky outcroppings, perhaps a quarter-mile behind her, she spotted them. 3 riders, spread out in a line, searching. They'd come after her. Clara looked around desperately for somewhere to hide, but the plateau offered little cover. A cluster of boulders 50 yards to her left might work, but reaching them would mean exposing herself, and if the riders had already spotted her, she ran anyway. What choice did she have? Her boots pounded against stone and sand, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The boulders seemed impossibly far away, the space between her and safety widening with each step rather than shrinking. Behind her, she heard a shout. They'd seen her. Clara pushed herself harder, her lungs burning, her legs threatening to give out. 20 yards, 10, 5. She dove behind the largest boulder just as gunfire erupted, bullets striking stone and kicking up sprays of sand. Clara pressed herself flat against the rock, making herself as small as possible, and tried to think. 3 riders. Probably Jack and 2 of his men. They knew roughly where she was, but in the darkness and shadow of the boulders, they couldn't get a clear shot. Not yet. But they would close in, surround her position, and then it would be over. Unless she moved first. Clara crawled on her hands and knees to the far side of the boulder cluster, staying low, ignoring the pain as sharp stones cut into her palms and knees. She could hear the riders circling, hear the creak of leather and the snort of horses. They were taking their time, confident in their advantage. A gap opened between 2 boulders, and Clara saw her chance. Beyond the gap was open ground for about 30 yards, then another outcropping of rock. If she could reach it before they saw her, she might be able to lose them in the darkness. She waited until the hoofbeats seemed farthest away, then bolted. 10 yards. 20. She was going to make it. Then a voice cut through the night, cold and mocking. "There!" Gunfire erupted again, but Clara was already diving behind the new outcropping, rolling into cover just as bullets struck where she'd been a heartbeat before. Her shoulder hit rock hard enough to leave her gasping, but she couldn't stop. Already she could hear the riders turning, coming after her. This outcropping was smaller, offering less protection. And worse, it was isolated. No other cover nearby, nothing but open ground in every direction. She'd trapped herself. "Come on out, girl," Jack's voice echoed across the rocks. "Make it easy on yourself. We just want to talk." Clara didn't bother responding. They both knew what kind of talk he had in mind. She searched frantically for anything that might help. A weapon, a hiding place, anything. Her hands closed around a rock about the size of her fist. It wasn't much, but it was something. The hoofbeats were closer now, circling her position. Clara peered around the edge of the outcropping and saw them, 3 dark shapes against the starlit sky, Jack in the center, Billy on his left, and another man she didn't recognize on his right. "Last chance," Jack called out. "Come out now and I promise we'll make it quick. Make us dig you out of there, and, well, Billy's got some ideas about how to spend the rest of the night that you won't enjoy." Claire's grip tightened on the rock. She'd rather die fighting than give them the satisfaction of seeing her surrender. But before she could make a move, something changed. The rider on Jack's right, the one she didn't recognize, suddenly jerked in his saddle and toppled sideways, hitting the ground hard. A fraction of a second later, the crack of a rifle shot echoed across the plateau. The other 2 riders wheeled their horses in confusion, shouting, trying to locate the shooter. Another shot rang out, and Billy's horse screamed and went down, throwing its rider. "Scatter!" Jack yelled, spurring his horse toward cover. Clara didn't understand what was happening, but she knew an opportunity when she saw one. While Jack and Billy were distracted, she ran again, this time angling away from where the shots had come from, putting distance between herself and everyone else. She'd made it 50 yards when a figure stepped out of the shadows directly in front of her. Clara skidded to a halt, raising the rock defensively, ready to fight. Then moonlight fell on the figure's face and her heart nearly stopped. "Ethan?" He looked like he'd been through hell. Blood ran from a cut above his left eye. His shirt was torn, and he was limping slightly. But he was alive, and he was here, and the rifle in his hands was still smoking from the shots he'd just fired. "I told you to run," he said, but there was no anger in his voice, just relief. "You're alive!" Clara couldn't quite believe it. "How did you—" "Later. Right now we need to move." Ethan grabbed her hand and pulled her into motion. "I bought us some time, but not much." They ran together through the darkness, Ethan leading the way with the sure-footedness of someone who could read terrain by starlight. Behind them, Clara could hear Jack's voice raised in fury, could hear the remaining horses being rallied. "What happened back there?" Clara gasped out as they ran. "At the canyon. Gambled that Jack wanted me alive more than dead. I was right, but just barely." Ethan's voice was tight with pain. "They tied me up again, started arguing about whether to go after you or wait until morning. I convinced them you'd get lost in the dark, circle back, be easy to find come daylight." "And they believed you?" "Jack didn't, but the others did. While they were arguing, I worked the ropes loose again and made a run for it." He helped her over a rough patch of ground, grabbed a rifle on the way out, stole one of their horses. "Been tracking you for the last hour." "You stole a horse while tied up and surrounded by armed men?" Clara couldn't keep the amazement out of her voice. "Wasn't tied up anymore by then. And they were distracted." Ethan managed something that might have been a smile. "I'm good at my job, Clara." They ran for another 10 minutes before Ethan finally slowed, leading Clara into a maze of tall rock formations that jutted from the plateau like broken teeth. Here, the shadows were deeper, the terrain more complex. Good for hiding, Clara realized. Bad for being found. Ethan found a narrow cleft between 2 rock walls and pulled Clara into it. They were completely hidden here, invisible from more than 10 feet away. He finally released her hand and leaned against the stone wall, breathing hard. "Are you hurt?" Clara asked, seeing how he favored his left side. "Couple of ribs. They got in a few good hits before I got away." Ethan checked his rifle, counting rounds. "Could be worse." Clara wanted to examine his injuries, to do something to help, but in the darkness there was little she could do. Instead, she asked the question that had been burning in her mind since the canyon. "Why did you come after me? You were free. You could have ridden for Pueblo, been halfway there by now." Ethan looked at her, his eyes catching what little light penetrated their hiding place. You really have to ask? Yes, you barely know me. We met 2 days ago. You don't owe me anything. Maybe not. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Or maybe I owe you everything. You were the first person in 2 years to look at me and see something worth saving. The first person to trust me despite having every reason not to. He shifted against the wall, wincing. I wasn't going to abandon that. Wasn't going to abandon you. Clara felt something shift in her chest, some final wall coming down. She'd been betrayed by her family, left to die by people who should have loved her. But this man, this stranger who'd had every excuse to ride away, had risked his life repeatedly to save hers. Thank you, she said softly, for coming back. Thank me when we make it to Pueblo alive. But there was warmth in Ethan's voice despite the grim words. They waited in the cleft for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes. Outside, they could hear the sounds of searching, horses moving over rock, men calling to each other, the occasional curse when someone's mount stumbled in the darkness. They're going to find us eventually, Clara whispered. There's only so much ground to cover. I know. Ethan checked his rifle again. I've got maybe 6 rounds left, not enough for a sustained fight. So what do we do? Ethan was quiet for a long moment, thinking. Finally he said, There's a dry creek bed about half a mile east of here. Runs all the way down to the valley where Pueblo sits. If we can reach it, we can follow it south. The banks will provide cover and the footing is good. We can move fast. And if they catch us before we reach it, then we fight. Simple words, simply stated. But I'd rather avoid that if we can. Jack's down to 3 men, including himself, but those are still bad odds. Clara nodded, understanding what he wasn't saying. In a straight fight, even with Ethan's skills, they would likely lose. Their only advantage was darkness and knowledge of the terrain. How do we get to this creek bed without being seen? Carefully. Ethan moved to the edge of the cleft and peered out. They're searching in a pattern, sweeping west to east. If we time it right, we can slip through the gaps in their line. It was a desperate plan, but it was the only plan they had. They waited until the sounds of searching moved past their position. Then Ethan led the way out of the cleft. He moved like a ghost, his feet finding purchase on silent stone, his body flowing from shadow to shadow. Clara did her best to follow, trying to match his careful movements, her heart hammering every time a stone shifted beneath her feet. The rock formations gave way to more open ground, and here Ethan slowed even further, taking time to study the landscape ahead before committing to each movement. Clara could see what he was doing, using the natural depressions in the terrain, the deeper shadows cast by rock outcroppings, anything that would keep them invisible. They'd covered perhaps 200 yards when Ethan suddenly froze, his hand shooting out to stop Clara. She followed his gaze and saw why. One of Jack's men was standing perhaps 30 yards ahead, silhouetted against the stars, scanning the landscape. He hadn't seen them yet, but he was looking in their direction, and if they moved, he would certainly spot them. Ethan and Clara pressed themselves flat against the ground, barely breathing. Clara could feel her pulse pounding in her temples, could hear the blood rushing in her ears. The outlaw took a step toward them, then another, his eyes searching the shadows. 20 yards now. 15. Ethan's hand found Clara's and squeezed once. A message. Be ready to run. 10 yards. The outlaw was close enough now that Clara could see the details of his face in the starlight, could see the rifle cradled in his arms. He stopped, cocking his head as if he'd heard something. Then a coyote howled somewhere in the distance, and the outlaw's attention shifted. He turned away from them, looking toward the source of the sound, and Ethan pulled Clara to her feet and they ran, staying low, moving away from the outlaw as quickly and quietly as they could. They'd made it 20 feet when the man turned back around. Clara saw him spot them, saw his eyes widen in recognition, saw him start to raise his rifle. Ethan was faster. His own rifle came up and he fired without seeming to aim, the shot echoing across the plateau. The outlaw went down hard and didn't move. Run! Ethan didn't wait to see if the man was dead or just wounded. He grabbed Clara's hand and they sprinted across the open ground, no longer trying to be quiet, just trying to put distance between themselves and the inevitable response to that gunshot. Shouts erupted behind them. Hoofbeats thundered across stone. More gunfire, but wild, shooting at shadows and sound rather than clear targets. The ground began to slope downward beneath Clara's feet, and she realized they'd reached the edge of the plateau. Ahead, she could see the dark line of the creek bed Ethan had mentioned, a channel cut deep into the earth. They were going to make it. Then Ethan's foot caught on something, a root, a stone, Clara never saw what, and he went down hard, the rifle flying from his hands. He tried to get up, gasped in pain, and collapsed again. "My ankle," he said through gritted teeth. "I think it's broken." Clara looked back and saw the riders coming, 2 of them now, charging across the plateau. They had maybe 30 seconds before Jack and Billy reached them. "Get up!" Clara grabbed Ethan's arm and tried to pull him to his feet. "Come on, we have to move." "I can't." Ethan pushed her away. "Go. Take the rifle and run for the creek bed. You can still make it." "Absolutely not." Clara grabbed the rifle herself, then hooked her other arm under Ethan's shoulder. "I'm not leaving you. Now get up or I'll drag you." Ethan stared at her for a moment, and Clara saw the exact moment he understood that she meant every word. He nodded once and leveraged himself upright, his face going white with pain as he put weight on his injured ankle. They made it to the edge of the creek bed just as the riders reached shooting distance. Bullets kicked up dirt around them as they half fell, half slid down the steep bank, Ethan biting back cries of pain every time his ankle hit something. The creek bed was deeper than Clara had expected, 8 or 9 feet below the level of the plateau, with steep banks on either side. Better yet, it twisted and turned, providing natural cover from above. They wouldn't be easy targets here, but they also couldn't move fast, not with Ethan's injury. "Which way?" Clara asked, looking both directions along the creek bed. "South." Ethan was leaning heavily on her now, his face slick with sweat. "Just keep heading south. The bed runs all the way to the valley, maybe 5 miles. If we can stay ahead of them that long, we'll hit settled territory. They won't risk following us there." 5 miles. With Ethan barely able to walk and 2 armed men hunting them, it seemed impossible. But Clara had learned something over the past 2 days. Impossible was just another way of saying difficult, and she was tired of running from difficult things. "All right," she said. 5 miles. Let's go." They started moving, Clara supporting most of Ethan's weight, the rifle slung over her shoulder. Progress was agonizingly slow. Every step sent visible jolts of pain through Ethan's body, but he didn't complain, just gritted his teeth and kept moving. Behind them, they could hear Jack and Billy at the edge of the plateau, shouting to each other, trying to figure out the best way down into the creek bed. The steep banks would force them to dismount and leave their horses, which gave Clara and Ethan some advantage. On foot, the chase would be more even. They rounded a bend in the creek bed, and Ethan pulled Clara to a stop. "Wait," he said, breathing hard. "Help me sit." "We don't have time. Clara, please. Just for a minute." She helped him lower himself to the sandy creek bottom, and he leaned back against the bank, his face contorted with pain. Now that they'd stopped, Clara could see how bad his ankle really was. It was swelling visibly, and the angle looked wrong. "It's not broken," Ethan said, following her gaze. "Just badly sprained, but I can't keep this pace, and you know it." "Then we'll go slower." "We don't have time to go slower." Ethan's voice was gentle but firm. "They'll catch us long before we reach the valley." Clara saw where this was going and shook her head violently. "No, don't you dare suggest it. I can hold them here. This bend in the creek bed provides good cover, and I've still got ammunition. I can slow them down, maybe stop them entirely, and you can make it to Pueblo." "I said no." Clara's voice came out fiercer than she'd intended. "We've been through this already. I'm not leaving you to die." "Clara, listen to me." She knelt beside him, meeting his eyes. "My entire life, people have told me what to do, what to sacrifice, who to be. My parents died, and I was told to be grateful for a home I didn't want. My uncle sold me to a man I despised and told me it was for my own good. When I finally stood up for myself, my family left me to die on a prairie." Her voice broke, but she pushed on. "You're the first person who's treated me like I have a choice, like what I want matters, so I'm choosing now. I'm choosing not to leave you." Ethan stared at her, emotions warring across his face. "You could die here because of that choice." "Then I'll die free." Clara stood and offered him her hand. "Now get up. We're both getting out of this." For a long moment, Ethan didn't move. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his face. A real smile, full of warmth and something that might have been admiration or affection or both. "You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met," he said. "Good. You'll need stubborn if we're going to survive this." Clara pulled him to his feet. "Come on, 5 miles. We can do 5 miles." They started moving again, even slower now, but still moving. The creek bed wound through the landscape like a scar, sometimes wide and shallow, sometimes narrow and deep. In places, rocks and debris littered the bottom, forcing them to pick their way carefully. Clara's arms ached from supporting Ethan's weight, but she didn't let go. They'd covered maybe a mile when they heard the sounds of pursuit behind them, footsteps echoing off the creek bed walls, getting closer. "They're on foot," Ethan said. "That's good. Means we're on even ground." "Except they can walk and you can't." "There is that." Ethan managed a strained laugh. "How much ammunition did you count in the rifle?" Clara checked. 4 rounds. 4 rounds, 2 men. Not ideal, but workable. Ethan scanned the creek bed ahead. "There. See where it narrows between those 2 big rocks? That's a choke point. Good place for an ambush." "You want to ambush them?" Clara couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. Better than waiting for them to ambush us. Ethan's expression had gone hard, his cavalry training showing through. "We set up there, wait for them to come through the narrow section, take them by surprise." "I've never shot anyone before." "You've never done a lot of things before, but you're still here." Clara looked at the rifle in her hands, then at Ethan's determined face, then back at the weapon. Could she really do this? Could she point this rifle at another human being and pull the trigger? The answer, she realized, depended on the alternative. If she didn't fight, they would both die. If she did fight, they might survive. Put that way, the choice was simple. "All right," she said. "Tell me what to do." They positioned themselves at the choke point, Ethan sitting with his back against one of the large rocks, Clara crouched behind the other. The rifle was heavy in her hands, and her palms were sweating despite the cool night air. "When they come through," Ethan said quietly, "wait until I fire first. Then you shoot at whoever's still standing. Aim for center mass, biggest target. Don't try for a headshot." Clara nodded, her mouth too dry to speak. "And Clara?" Ethan waited until she looked at him. "Thank you. For not leaving, for choosing to stay. Thank me when we're safe in Pueblo," she said, echoing his words from earlier. The sounds of pursuit grew louder. Footsteps, heavy breathing, the scrape of boots on sand. Clara's heart pounded so hard she was sure the approaching men would hear it. Then Jack Reeves and Billy appeared around the bend, silhouetted against the starlit sky. They were moving cautiously, weapons raised, clearly aware that this was perfect ambush terrain. Billy was in front, Jack a few steps behind. They approached the choke point slowly, scanning the shadows. Clara held her breath, her finger resting lightly on the trigger. Beside her, she could sense Ethan doing the same, waiting for the perfect moment. Billy stepped into the narrow passage between the rocks. Ethan fired. The shot echoed like thunder in the confined space, and Billy went down, clutching his leg. Jack dove for cover, firing blindly, bullets ricocheting off rock. "Now!" Ethan shouted. Clara raised the rifle, sighted on where Jack had disappeared behind a boulder, and fired. The recoil surprised her, slamming the stock into her shoulder hard enough to leave a bruise. But she'd hit something. She heard Jack curse in pain. 2 shots left. Billy was trying to crawl back the way they'd come, leaving a trail of blood on the sand. Ethan fired again, and Billy stopped moving. 1 shot left. Jack was pinned behind his boulder, wounded but still dangerous. Clara could see part of his shadow, could track his movements by the way the darkness shifted. He was trying to get a better angle, trying to find a position where he could return fire. "Give it up, Jack!" Ethan called out. "You're done!" Jack's response was a bullet that struck inches from Ethan's head, showering him with rock fragments. "We can end this," Jack shouted back. "You got Billy. You got me hit. You've won. Just let me walk away, and we're square." "After everything you've done?" Ethan's voice was hard. "After hunting us for 2 days, after threatening to kill us both? You really think I'm going to let you walk away? You let me go, or I make sure you never make it to Pueblo. I've got friends, Ethan. More men who'll come looking. This won't end with me." Clara saw movement in the shadows. Jack was repositioning, trying to flank them. She raised the rifle, tracking the movement, waiting for a clear shot. "It ends now," Ethan said. "Drop your weapon and come out. I'll make sure you get a fair trial." Jack laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "A trial? For what I've done? They'll hang me for sure. Rather die out here." "That can be arranged." Everything happened at once. Jack broke from cover, running and firing simultaneously. Ethan returned fire and missed. Clara pulled the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. The shot echoed, and Jack Reeves stumbled, clutched his chest, and fell. He tried to get up once, his face twisted with shock and pain, then collapsed and was still. Clara lowered the rifle, her hand shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. She'd just killed a man, shot him dead. The reality of it hit her like a physical blow, and she felt her knees go weak. "Clara." Ethan's voice cut through the roaring in her ears. "Clara, look at me." She turned to him, and he was there, leaning against the rock but steady, his eyes clear. "You did what you had to do," he said firmly. "He gave you no choice. You understand that?" Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. "You saved both our lives. That matters more than anything else." Slowly, Clara felt the shaking subside. Ethan was right. She'd had no choice. Jack would have killed them both without a second thought. What she'd done wasn't murder, it was survival. "Is he dead?" she asked. Ethan limped over to where Jack lay and checked for a pulse. He nodded. "He's gone." Clara closed her eyes for a moment, processing this. When she opened them again, something had changed. The fear that had been driving her since the wagon train abandoned her, the panic that had filled every moment since Jack's gang had started hunting them, it was gone. In its place was something harder, something forged in the crucible of the past 2 days. "We should keep moving," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded, "before anyone else shows up." Ethan looked at her with something like pride. "Yes, we should." They searched the bodies quickly, taking what supplies they needed: water canteens, a knife, ammunition that didn't fit their rifle but might be useful for barter. Clara tried not to look at Jack's face, tried not to think about the fact that she'd ended a human life, but it was impossible to ignore entirely. When they started moving again, heading south along the creek bed, Clara felt the weight of what she'd done settling over her like a heavy cloak. But beneath that weight was something else, a grim satisfaction. She'd stood her ground. She'd fought back. She'd survived. The moon was setting by the time they finally saw the lights of Pueblo in the distance, a warm glow against the darkness of the valley below. The creek bed had widened, become shallower, and was starting to show signs of recent water flow. They were getting close to civilization. "Almost there," Ethan said, though his voice was tight with exhaustion and pain. "Just a little further." They emerged from the creek bed as dawn was breaking, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. Pueblo lay before them, a sprawling collection of buildings at the confluence of 2 rivers, smoke rising from chimneys, the sounds of early morning activity drifting across the distance. They'd made it. Clara helped Ethan the last mile into town, both of them filthy and exhausted, looking like they'd survived exactly the kind of ordeal they had. The first people they encountered, a woman hanging laundry in her yard, took one look at them and ran to get help. Within minutes, they were surrounded by concerned citizens. Someone sent for the doctor. Someone else fetched the sheriff. Clara tried to explain what had happened, but the words wouldn't come out right, and everything started to blur together. She remembered being led to a clean room somewhere. Remembered gentle hands washing the dirt and blood from her face. Remembered someone pressing a cup of water to her lips and telling her to drink. And then, finally feeling safe for the first time in days, Clara Whitmore let herself collapse into exhausted sleep. When she woke, sunlight was streaming through a window, and a kind-faced older woman was sitting in a chair beside the bed. "Welcome back, dear," the woman said with a smile. "You've been asleep for nearly 12 hours. How do you feel?" Clara took stock of herself. Her body ached in places she didn't know could ache. Her hands were bandaged, and her jaw was tender where she'd hit the ground during the chase. But she was clean, she was safe, and she was alive. "Better," she said. "Where's Ethan?" "The gentleman you came in with? He's down the hall. Doctor's setting his ankle properly. He's going to be fine." The woman patted Clara's hand. You both are. That's quite a story you told the sheriff last night, though I'm not sure you remember telling it. Clara had a vague memory of talking to someone in a uniform, but the details were fuzzy. What did I say? Everything, from what I understand. About being abandoned by your family, about Mr. Cole rescuing you, about the outlaws who chased you through the canyons. The woman's expression grew serious. The sheriff sent men out at first light to verify your story. They found the bodies where you said they'd be. Clara felt her stomach turn. The bodies. Jack Reeves and his men. Evidence of violence that couldn't be denied or forgotten. Am I in trouble? She asked quietly. Trouble? The woman looked surprised. Lord, no, child. You defended yourself against outlaws. The sheriff says you're a hero, both of you. Those men were wanted for robbery and murder. There was even a reward. A reward. Clara hadn't thought about that. Hadn't thought about anything beyond surviving. How much? She asked. $500 for Jack Reeves, smaller amounts for the others. Should come to about $800 all told, to be split between you and Mr. Cole. $800? It was more money than Clara had ever imagined having. Enough to start over. Enough to build a life. When can I see Ethan? Once you've had something to eat and the doctor's finished with him. The woman stood and smoothed her apron. But first, there's someone here who wants to talk to you. A Mr. Harrison from the school board. Says he heard about a young lady who can read and write and do figures, and he's been looking for a teacher for the new schoolhouse. Clara stared at her, not quite believing what she was hearing. A teacher? He wants to hire me as a teacher? Well, he wants to interview you first, but yes. Says the town's growing fast and they're desperate for someone qualified. The woman smiled. Seems like fate's finally turning in your favor, dear. After she left, Clara lay back against the pillows, trying to process everything. 2 days ago, she'd been abandoned on the prairie with no hope and no future. Now she was safe in Pueblo, with the possibility of work as a teacher and enough money to support herself while she established her life here. And Ethan was down the hall, alive and recovering. Everything had changed. Everything. There was a knock at the door, and Clara called out for whoever it was to enter. The door opened, and Ethan limped in, his ankle wrapped in fresh bandages, leaning on a crutch. His face was clean now, the cuts treated, and despite the obvious pain he was in, he was smiling. They told me you were awake, he said. They told me you were having your ankle set. Finished with that torture half an hour ago, Ethan made his way to the chair the woman had vacated and lowered himself carefully into it. How are you holding up? I'm alive. We're both alive. Clara felt tears prickling at her eyes and didn't try to stop them this time. I wasn't sure we would be. I know. There were a few moments I wasn't sure either. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Clara, about what happened in the creek bed, what you did. I killed a man. You stopped a man who was trying to kill us both. There's a difference. Is there? Clara wiped at her eyes. It doesn't feel different. It will. Eventually. Ethan's voice was gentle. I've had to make hard choices too, had to do things I wish I hadn't. The weight of it never completely goes away, but it gets easier to carry. And knowing you did it for the right reasons helps. Clara nodded, wanting to believe him. The sheriff sent men to verify our story. I know, they found Jack and Billy in the creek bed, found the third man on the plateau, found evidence of the camp in the canyon. Everything checks out. Ethan shifted in his chair, wincing slightly. They also found something interesting. What? Turns out Jack was carrying a considerable sum of money, $2,200 tucked in his saddlebags. The sheriff thinks it might be from other robberies, but Ethan met her eyes. I'm pretty sure I know what it is. Clara's breath caught. The missing payroll money. $8,000 went missing 2 years ago. $2,200 is just over a quarter of that. If Jack had been smart, he'd have buried it, left it hidden until things cooled down. But Jack was never as smart as he thought he was. What happens to it? Legally? It goes back to the army, I suppose. But there's a reward for recovered stolen property, usually 10%. That would be another $220 split between us. More money, more than enough to truly start over. There's something else, Ethan continued. The sheriff offered me a job. Deputy sheriff, working for him here in Pueblo. Says the town needs men who can track, who can handle themselves in a fight. He paused. I'm thinking about taking it. Clara felt something warm bloom in her chest. You'd stay? Here in Pueblo? Been thinking about it all morning. I'm tired of wandering, Clara. Tired of being alone. This town seems nice enough. And after everything. He looked at her directly. After everything, I'd like to stick around, if that's all right with you. The school board wants to interview me for a teaching position, Clara said. If I get it, I'll be staying too. Ethan smiled, that slow, warm smile she was beginning to recognize. Then I guess we both found what we were looking for. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, two people who'd survived the impossible, who'd found each other in the worst circumstances and chosen to hold on. What happens now? Clara asked. Now? Ethan leaned back in his chair. Now we heal. We rest. We figure out how to be normal people living normal lives. And we see where that takes us. It was a simple plan, but it was enough. More than enough. Clara Whitmore had started this journey abandoned and alone, left to die by the people who should have protected her. She'd ended it with a future, a purpose, and a man who'd risked everything to ensure she survived. The road ahead would have its own challenges, its own hardships, but for the first time in longer than she could remember, Clara was ready to face them. Not because she had to, but because she chose to, and that made all the difference. The interview with Mr. Harrison took place 3 days later in the parlor of the boarding house where Clara had taken a room. She'd spent those 3 days recuperating, letting her body heal from the ordeal in the canyons, while her mind tried to process everything that had happened. The nightmares came every night, visions of Jack Reeves falling, of gunfire echoing through stone passages, of Ethan's face when he told her to run. But each morning, she woke to sunlight streaming through clean windows and the sound of Pueblo coming to life outside, and the nightmares seemed a little less real. Mr. Harrison was a thin man in his 50s with wire-rimmed spectacles and an air of perpetual worry. He sat across from Clara with a leather folder on his lap, studying her with the intensity of someone trying to read a book in dim light. Miss Whitmore, he began, clearing his throat. I must confess, when I heard about your arrival in Pueblo, I was skeptical. We've had several applicants for the teaching position, but most have been wholly unsuitable. Young men looking for easy work, women with no education to speak of, drifters who could barely read themselves. Clara kept her hands folded in her lap, trying to project a calm she didn't entirely feel. This interview mattered more than she'd allowed herself to admit. Teaching wasn't just a job, it was the dream she'd clung to through all the darkness of the past weeks. The dream that had cost her everything when she'd refused to give it up for Raymond Butcher. I can assure you, Mr. Harrison, I'm quite serious about teaching. I've wanted to be a teacher since I was a child. So I've heard. Mr. Harrison consulted his notes. Sheriff Dawson spoke very highly of you, said you showed remarkable composure under circumstances that would have broken most people, but composure in the face of danger and competence in the classroom are two different things. He looked up at her. Tell me about your education. Clara took a breath and began. She told him about her mother teaching her to read, about the small school in St. Louis where she'd learned mathematics and composition. She told him about the books she'd devoured, the essays she'd written, the younger children she'd tutored to earn extra money for her family. I know I don't have formal credentials, she admitted. No certificate from a teaching college, no references from established educators, but I can demonstrate my knowledge if you'd like. Test me on any subject you choose. Mr. Harrison considered this, then reached into his folder and pulled out a piece of paper. Very well. I have here a mathematical problem that stumped our last applicant completely. Let's see how you fare. He handed her the paper, and Clara studied it. It was a word problem involving the cost of lumber for building a schoolhouse, calculating board feet and material waste. Not particularly difficult if you understood the principles involved. May I have paper and a pencil? She asked. Mr. Harrison provided them, and Clara worked through the problem methodically, showing her calculations clearly. When she finished, she handed both the paper and her work back to him. He studied her solution for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, to Clara's surprise, he smiled. That's correct. Not only correct, but you've shown your work in a way that would make it easy for students to understand the process. He set the papers aside. Let's try literature. Can you name 3 works of Shakespeare and briefly describe their themes? Clara could, and did. Then Mr. Harrison moved on to geography, to history, to the natural sciences. Each question she answered carefully and thoroughly, drawing on every book she'd ever read, every lesson she'd absorbed. Finally, after nearly an hour, Mr. Harrison sat back in his chair and removed his spectacles, polishing them thoughtfully. Miss Whitmore, I'll be direct with you. Our schoolhouse has been without a proper teacher for 6 months. The children are falling behind and the parents are growing restless. We need someone who can step in immediately and bring order to chaos, someone who can handle not just the academic instruction, but the discipline issues, the parents' concerns, the daily challenges of frontier education. He replaced his spectacles. I believe you might be that person. Clara's heart leapt, but she kept her expression neutral. You're offering me the position? I'm offering you a trial period, 1 month, starting next Monday. The salary is $35 per month, plus room and board. If at the end of the month both you and the school board are satisfied with the arrangement, we'll make it permanent. He extended his hand. Do we have an agreement? Clara shook his hand firmly, trying not to let the trembling of relief show through. We do. Thank you, Mr. Harrison. You won't regret this. I certainly hope not. He stood, gathering his materials. The schoolhouse is on the north end of town, near the new church. I'll introduce you to the facilities tomorrow morning, and we can discuss the curriculum. You'll have approximately 20 students, ages 6 to 14. After he left, Clara sat alone in the parlor, letting the reality of what had just happened sink in. She had a job, a real teaching position. The thing she'd fought for, the dream that had led to her abandonment on the prairie, was finally within her grasp. She needed to tell Ethan. She found him outside the sheriff's office, sitting on a bench in the afternoon sun with his injured ankle propped up on a crate. He'd taken the deputy position Sheriff Dawson had offered, though he couldn't start proper duties until his ankle healed. For now, he was doing what he could from the bench, talking to citizens, offering advice, keeping an eye on the street. His face lit up when he saw her approaching, and Clara felt that now familiar warmth in her chest at the sight of his smile. You're looking pleased with yourself, he said as she sat down beside him. I'm guessing the interview went well? He offered me the position, 1 month trial, then permanent if everything works out. Clara couldn't keep the excitement out of her voice. I start Monday. Clara, that's wonderful. Ethan's genuine happiness for her success was written all over his face. I knew you'd get it. You're going to be an excellent teacher. I hope so. 20 students, Mr. Harrison said, ages 6 to 14, all in one classroom. The magnitude of it was starting to hit her. What if I can't manage them? What if the parents don't approve of me? What if... Hey! Ethan's hand found hers, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. You survived 2 days being hunted by outlaws through the Colorado wilderness. You faced down armed men without flinching. You saved both our lives more than once. Teaching 20 children is going to seem easy by comparison. Clara laughed despite her nervousness. I'm not sure that logic holds up, but I appreciate the sentiment. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching Pueblo go about its daily business. It was a growing town, Claire had learned over the past few days. The railroad was coming through in another year, which meant more settlers, more commerce, more opportunity. The rough frontier settlement of a decade ago was transforming into something more permanent, more civilized. Have you thought about where you'll live? Ethan asked. The boarding house is fine for now, but if you're staying permanently... Mr. Harrison mentioned the teaching position comes with room and board. There's a small cottage behind the schoolhouse meant for the teacher. I'll move there once I start. That's good. Practical. Ethan was quiet for a moment. I found a place too. Small house on the east side of town near the livery. Sheriff Dawson helped me negotiate the rent. Says I can probably buy it outright in a year or two if I want, once I've saved enough from the deputy salary and the reward money. The reward money. They'd received it 2 days ago, the full $800 plus the additional amount for the recovered payroll funds. Clara's share had come to $510, more money than she'd ever held in her life. She'd opened an account at the town's small bank, feeling very grown-up and official as she'd watched the clerk record the deposit. We're really doing this, she said softly. Building lives here, putting down roots. Seems like it. Ethan looked at her, his gray-blue eyes serious. Does it feel right to you? Being here, I mean, after everything that happened? Clara considered the question carefully. Did it feel right? A week ago, she'd been a woman with no future, abandoned by her family, facing death on the prairie. Now she had work she'd dreamed of, money in the bank, safety, and the chance to build the life she'd always wanted. And she had Ethan. Whatever was growing between them, friendship, certainly, but perhaps something deeper, too, felt like the most right thing of all. Yes, she said finally. It feels exactly right. The days before Clara's teaching position began passed in a blur of activity. She met with Mr. Harrison twice more, reviewing the curriculum and touring the schoolhouse. The building was simple but well constructed, a single large room with windows on 3 sides to provide light, benches for the students, and a proper blackboard at the front. The cottage behind it was small but clean, with a bedroom, a sitting room, and a tiny kitchen. Clara spent a day scrubbing it from top to bottom, arranging the few possessions she'd accumulated, making it home. Ethan helped when he could, hobbling around on his crutch, carrying things that were too heavy for her to manage alone. His presence made the work easier, his dry comments about her exacting cleaning standards making her laugh when the task felt overwhelming. "You know the students are going to track mud all over these floors the first day," he said, watching her scrub the bedroom floor for the second time. "Then I'll clean them again. But they're going to start clean." "Stubborn," Ethan muttered, but he was smiling. On Sunday evening, the night before her first day of teaching, Clara found herself too nervous to eat the dinner she'd prepared. She sat at her small table, pushing food around her plate, trying not to think about all the things that could go wrong tomorrow. A knock at the door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. When she opened it, Ethan stood there with a bundle wrapped in brown paper. "I know you're probably trying to prepare for tomorrow," he said, "but I thought you might need a distraction. May I come in?" Clara stepped aside, grateful for his presence. He limped to the table and set down the bundle, then lowered himself carefully into one of her 2 chairs. "What's this?" Clara asked, eyeing the package. "Open it." She unwrapped the paper carefully and found herself holding a beautiful leather-bound journal, the kind with a clasp and thick cream-colored pages. On the front, embossed in gold lettering, were the words Miss C. Whitmore, teacher. "Ethan." Clara was speechless. "This is beautiful. But you didn't have to." "I wanted to. Every teacher needs a place to keep notes, record lessons, write down the funny things students say." He smiled. "My mother was a teacher before she died. She had a journal just like that. Used to read entries to me sometimes about her students and their progress. It was important to her." Clara looked up from the journal, seeing Ethan in a new light. "You never mentioned your mother was a teacher." "Haven't talked much about my family. Never seemed like the right time." Ethan shifted in his chair. "But watching you prepare for this, seeing how much it means to you, it reminded me of her. She loved teaching the way you do, believed it was the most important work a person could do." "It is," Clara said softly. She opened the journal, running her fingers over the smooth pages. "Thank you. This means more than you know." They talked for hours that evening, Clara's nervousness about the next day gradually fading as Ethan told her stories about his mother, how she'd taught in a small school in Missouri, how she'd made learning an adventure for her students, how she'd believed every child deserved an education regardless of their circumstances. "She sounds like she was an amazing woman," Clara said. "She would have liked you, I think." Ethan's expression grew distant. "After she died, my father fell apart. Started drinking, couldn't hold work. That's how I ended up alone at 12. He drank himself to death within a year." Clara reached across the table and took his hand. "I'm sorry. It was a long time ago." But she could hear the old pain in his voice. "Point is, I know what it's like to lose everything. And I know what it's like to find something worth building a future around. You're doing that, Clara. You're creating something meaningful here. So are you. The town needs a good deputy sheriff as much as it needs a good teacher." "Maybe," Ethan smiled. "We're quite a pair, aren't we? The abandoned girl and the former cavalry scout making new lives in Pueblo." "I wouldn't have it any other way," Clara said, and meant it. Monday morning dawned clear and cold, frost glittering on the ground outside Clara's cottage. She dressed carefully in her best dress, dark blue with a simple collar, professional and practical, and pinned her hair into a neat bun. When she looked at herself in the small mirror above her wash basin, She almost didn't recognize the woman looking back. Gone was the frightened girl abandoned on the prairie. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who'd survived the impossible and emerged ready to face new challenges. The students began arriving at 8 o'clock. They came in groups and alone, some eager, some reluctant, all curious about their new teacher. Clara stood at the door of the schoolhouse, greeting each one by name as Mr. Harrison had taught her, noting their ages and trying to remember the details he'd shared about each family. There was Tommy Henderson, age 7, whose father ran the general store. Sarah and Samuel Morrison, twins age 10, from one of the farming families outside town. Elizabeth Chen, 12, daughter of the Chinese laundry owner, who Mr. Harrison had quietly warned faced prejudice from some of the other families. A dozen others, each with their own stories, their own challenges. By 8:30, they were all assembled in the schoolhouse, 20 pairs of eyes watching Clara with varying degrees of interest and skepticism. She stood at the front of the room, her new journal in hand, and felt the weight of the moment. This was it. Her dream finally realized. "Good morning," she said, and was pleased when her voice came out steady and clear. "My name is Miss Whitmore, and I'm your new teacher. I know many of you have been without regular instruction for several months, and I know some of you might not be happy about being back in school." A few of the older boys smirked at this, confirming her suspicion. "But here's what I want you to understand," Clara continued. "This classroom is going to be different from what you might have experienced before. We're going to work hard, yes, but we're also going to make learning something you look forward to. We're going to explore ideas together, ask questions, make discoveries, and most importantly, we're going to respect each other, every single person in this room, regardless of age or background." She let her gaze sweep across the students, meeting each set of eyes, making sure they understood she was serious. "Now, I'd like to start by learning about each of you. We're going to go around the room, and I want you to tell me your name, your age, and one thing you're curious about. One thing you want to know more about. It can be anything, how birds fly, why the sky is blue, where the railroad goes, anything at all." There was a moment of uncertain silence. Then Tommy Henderson's hand shot up. "I'm Tommy, I'm 7, and I want to know how come some rocks sparkle and some don't." Clara smiled. "That's an excellent question, Tommy. We'll definitely explore that. Who's next?" Slowly at first, then with growing enthusiasm, the students introduced themselves. Their questions ranged from the practical to the philosophical. Why do seasons change? How do you build a house that won't fall down? Where does the sun go at night? Why do some people have different colored skin than others? Clara made notes in her journal as they spoke, already planning lessons that would address their curiosities. This was going to work, she realized. These children were hungry for knowledge, starved for someone who would take their questions seriously. By the end of the first day, Clara was exhausted, but exhilarated. The older boys she'd been worried about had tested her boundaries early on, but she'd handled them firmly and fairly, earning grudging respect. Elizabeth Chen had revealed herself to be remarkably bright, reading at a level far beyond her peers. The younger children had needed more guidance, but had been eager to please. As the last student left and Clara sat down at her desk to record notes about the day, she heard familiar footsteps at the door. "How did it go?" Ethan asked, leaning against the doorframe. His ankle was healing well. He could put weight on it now without the crutch, though he still limped. "It was wonderful," Clara said, and realized she meant it. "Challenging, exhausting, but wonderful. These children are so eager to learn, Ethan. They just needed someone to give them structure and attention. Told you you'd be good at this." He crossed to her desk and perched on the edge. "Saw a few of the parents waiting outside earlier. They seemed impressed." "Really?" Clara looked up from her notes. "How could you tell?" "Mrs. Henderson told me her Tommy hasn't stopped talking about you since he got home. Says you're the smartest person he's ever met, and you promised to teach him about rocks." Ethan grinned. "You've got at least one fan." Over the following weeks, Clara settled into the rhythm of teaching. Each day brought new challenges, students who struggled with reading, mathematical concepts that needed breaking down into simpler parts, occasional discipline issues that required firm but fair handling. But each day also brought victories. The moment when a struggling reader finally sounded out a complete sentence, the pride on a student's face when they solved a difficult problem, the thoughtful questions that showed children were truly thinking, not just memorizing. Word spread through Pueblo that the new teacher was doing good work. Parents began stopping by to thank her, to ask about their children's progress. Mr. Harrison visited weekly and seemed increasingly pleased with what he observed. Meanwhile, Ethan had thrown himself into his deputy duties. With his ankle healed, he was riding patrol, settling disputes, bringing order to the growing town. Clara would see him sometimes during the day, tipping his hat as he rode past the schoolhouse, and her students would whisper and giggle about the handsome deputy who always smiled at Miss Whitmore. They fell into a comfortable routine. Clara would finish her teaching day and return to her cottage to prepare lessons for the next day. Ethan would stop by in the evenings when his duties allowed, and they would sit on her small porch, talking about their days, their hopes, their slowly building lives in Pueblo. One evening, about 6 weeks after Clara had started teaching, Ethan arrived with news that he was unusually excited about. "The town council met today," he said, settling into the chair beside her. "They're planning a harvest celebration next month, dancing, food, games for the children. The whole town's invited." "That sounds lovely," Clara said, though she felt a flutter of nervousness. She'd never been much for social gatherings, and the thought of the whole town assembled in one place was slightly overwhelming. "I was thinking," Ethan hesitated, and Clara realized with surprise that he seemed nervous too. "I was thinking maybe you'd let me escort you. To the celebration, I mean, if you wanted." Clara looked at him, seeing the hope and uncertainty in his eyes, and felt her heart swell. Over the past weeks, she'd grown to care for Ethan Cole more than she'd allowed herself to admit. He was kind and brave and decent in ways that made her former family's cruelty seem even more incomprehensible. But more than that, he saw her, truly saw her, in a way no one else ever had. "I'd like that," she said softly. "I'd like that very much." Ethan's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Yeah?" "Yeah." He reached for her hand and Clara let him take it, her fingers intertwining with his. They sat like that as the sun set over Pueblo. Two people who'd found each other in the worst circumstances and chosen to build something beautiful from the wreckage. The harvest celebration was everything Ethan had promised and more. The town square had been transformed with strings of lanterns, tables laden with food, and a raised platform for the musicians. It seemed like every resident of Pueblo and the surrounding farms had turned out, dressed in their finest, ready to celebrate the successful growing season. Clara wore a new dress she'd purchased with some of her reward money, a deep green that brought out the color of her eyes. She'd let her hair down from its usual severe bun, pinning it up in a softer style that made her look younger, less like a stern schoolmarm. When Ethan had arrived to escort her, the look on his face had been worth every penny the dress had cost. "You look beautiful," he'd said, and the sincerity in his voice had made Clara blush. "You clean up pretty well yourself," she'd responded, taking in his neat suit and freshly shaved face. The evening was magical. Clara's students surrounded her immediately, excited to introduce her to their parents, to show off the things they'd learned in school. She met farmers and merchants, the blacksmith and the doctor, people who were becoming the fabric of her new community. When the music started, Ethan led her to the dancing area. Clara had never learned to dance properly, but Ethan was patient, guiding her through the steps of a simple waltz. "Where did you learn to dance?" she asked as he spun her gently. "Army officers' ball, years ago. They made us all learn the basics, said it was part of being civilized." He smiled. "Hated it at the time, but I'm grateful for it now." They danced 3 dances before taking a break, and Clara noticed the approving looks from the townspeople. Ethan Cole and Clara Whitmore were becoming a recognized pair, she realized. The thought should have made her nervous, but instead it felt right. "Want to take a walk?" Ethan asked as the musicians took a break. "Get away from the crowd for a bit?" Clara nodded, and he led her away from the square, down toward the river that ran along Pueblo's eastern edge. The sounds of the celebration faded behind them, replaced by the gentle rush of water over stones. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light across the landscape. They walked along the riverbank until they found a fallen log to sit on, far enough from town for privacy, but close enough to still hear the distant music. "I've been thinking," Ethan said after a long moment of comfortable silence, "about the future, about what I want my life to look like." Clara's heart began to beat faster. "And what do you want?" "I want to stay here, in Pueblo, Build something permanent. Stop running from place to place like I have been for the past 2 years. He turned to face her fully. And I want you in that future, Clara, if you'll have me. Ethan, Clara felt tears prickling at her eyes. I know it's fast. I know we've only known each other a couple months, but those months have meant more to me than years with anyone else ever did. You make me want to be better, to build something that lasts. You make me want to put down roots. Clara reached up and touched his face, feeling the roughness of his jaw beneath her palm. You saved my life, multiple times, but more than that, you gave me the courage to save myself. You believed in me when no one else did. So is that a yes? Clara laughed through her tears. You haven't actually asked me a question yet. Ethan took both her hands in his expression serious, but his eyes warm. Clara Whitmore, would you consider a future with me? Not right now, not tomorrow, but someday when we're both ready? Would you consider letting this thing between us grow into something permanent? It wasn't a proposal exactly, but it was a promise, a commitment to see where this path led together. Yes, Clara said. I would very much consider that. Ethan pulled her close and kissed her, gentle and sweet. And Clara felt like every hardship she'd endured, every moment of fear and pain and uncertainty had led her to exactly this place, this moment, this man. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Clara rested her forehead against his. My family tried to destroy me when I wouldn't bend to their will, she said quietly. They thought leaving me to die on that prairie would teach me that I couldn't survive without them, that I needed to accept their choices for my life. They were wrong, Ethan said. They were wrong, Clara agreed. I'm stronger than they ever knew, stronger than I ever knew, and I built this life myself with my own hands and my own choices. Not quite by yourself, Ethan pointed out gently. Clara smiled. No, not quite. I had help from a stubborn cowboy who wouldn't leave me behind. They sat by the river for another hour, talking about their dreams for the future. Ethan spoke of maybe buying land outside town someday, keeping horses, building something with his hands. Clara talked about expanding the school as Pueblo grew, maybe training other teachers, creating a real education system for the frontier. All of it felt possible. All of it felt within reach. When they finally returned to the celebration hand in hand, the music was still playing and the lanterns still glowed warm in the darkness. Clara's students spotted her and came running over, begging her to dance with them. She spent the next hour being spun around by enthusiastic children while Ethan watched from the sidelines, his expression fond. Later, as he walked her home under the starlit sky, Clara reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in such a short time. 2 months ago, she'd been a woman with no future, no hope, no control over her own destiny. Now she had work she loved, a community that valued her, enough money to support herself, and a man who saw her as an equal partner rather than property to be managed. At her door, Ethan kissed her goodnight, a sweet promise of more to come. Thank you, Clara said, for tonight, for everything. Thank you for not running away from me that first day on the prairie, Ethan replied with a smile. Best decision I ever made, stopping to help you. Best decision I ever made, saying yes to that help. After he left, Clara sat on her porch for a long while, looking up at the stars and thinking about the journey that had brought her here. The pain of betrayal still lived in her heart. It probably always would, but it was no longer the defining feature of her story. She'd been abandoned, yes, left to die by people who should have loved her, but she'd survived. More than survived, she'd thrived. She'd found strength she didn't know she had, courage she'd never tested before, and a capacity for hope that even the worst circumstances couldn't destroy. Her family had meant to break her with their abandonment. Instead, they'd freed her to become someone she never could have been under their control. It was the greatest gift they could have given her, though they'd never intended it that way. Clara Whitmore went to sleep that night with a smile on her face and dreams of the future dancing through her mind. Tomorrow, she would return to her classroom, to her students and their eager questions. Tomorrow, Ethan would ride patrol, keeping Pueblo safe. Tomorrow, they would both continue building the lives they'd chosen, one day at a time. And someday, when they were both ready, they would build that future together. Not because anyone told them to, not because circumstances forced them into it, but because they chose it freely. That freedom, Clara had learned, was worth more than any security purchased through compliance. It was worth every hardship, every moment of fear, every trial she'd endured. She'd been left with nothing on the Colorado prairie and had built everything from that emptiness. And she would never, ever take that for granted again. The first snow came to Pueblo in late November, 3 months after Clara had arrived in town more dead than alive. She stood at the window of her classroom, watching fat white flakes drift down from a gray sky while her students worked on their arithmetic problems. The transformation of the landscape felt symbolic somehow, the harsh browns and golds of autumn giving way to something softer, cleaner, like the world was being offered a fresh start, much like her own life had been. "Miss Whitmore," Elizabeth Chen's voice pulled Clara from her thoughts. "I've finished the problems. May I help Tommy with his?" Clara smiled at the girl who'd become one of her brightest students. "Yes, but remember, guide him to the answer. Don't just give it to him." "I know, Miss Whitmore. You've told us that 100 times." But Elizabeth's tone was affectionate rather than exasperated. As Clara watched her students work together, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. In 3 months, she'd transformed this classroom from a chaotic holding pen into a real learning environment. The school board had been so impressed that they'd already confirmed her position as permanent and even discussed raising her salary for the next term. The snow was falling harder when school let out for the day. Clara stood at the door, making sure each child was properly bundled before sending them home. Tommy Henderson's mother arrived to collect him, pulling Clara aside with a grateful smile. "I wanted to thank you again, Miss Whitmore. Tommy's reading has improved so much. His father and I are amazed at the change." "He's a bright boy who just needed someone to believe in him," Clara said, watching Tommy show his mother a drawing he'd made during their natural science lesson. After the last student had gone, Clara returned to her classroom to prepare for the next day's lessons. She was deep in thought, working out a plan for teaching the older students about the founding of the nation, when she heard footsteps on the schoolhouse porch. She looked up, expecting Ethan, he usually stopped by after his patrol, but instead found herself facing a woman she'd never seen before. The stranger was perhaps 40, well-dressed in traveling clothes that spoke of money and status. Her face was drawn with exhaustion, and there was something familiar about the set of her jaw, the color of her eyes. "Can I help you?" Clara asked, standing. The woman studied Clara with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "You're Clara Whitmore." It wasn't a question, but Clara nodded anyway. "I am. And you are?" "Margaret Whitmore, your aunt." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. She gripped the edge of her desk to steady herself, 1,000 emotions flooding through her at once. Anger, betrayal, fear, and underneath it all, a small wounded part of her that had never stopped being the abandoned girl on the prairie. "What do you want?" Clara's voice came out harder than she'd intended, but she didn't soften it. Margaret flinched slightly at the coldness in her niece's tone. "I came to find you, to explain, to—" She broke off, looking around the classroom as if seeing it for the first time. "You're a teacher. You actually became a teacher." "Yes, despite everyone's best efforts to prevent it." Clara crossed her arms, trying to keep her composure. "You have 2 minutes to say whatever you came to say, and then I want you to leave." Margaret moved further into the classroom, her eyes taking in the neat rows of benches, the blackboard covered with Clara's handwriting, the children's drawings pinned to the walls. When she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "Your uncle is dead. He died 6 weeks ago, 3 days after the wagon train reached the settlement." Clara felt nothing at this news. No grief, no satisfaction, just a hollow emptiness where familial feeling should have been. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Are you?" Margaret's laugh was bitter. "I wouldn't be in your position. Clara, I need you to understand. Leaving you wasn't my idea. I fought against it. I told your uncle it was wrong, that we couldn't just abandon you in the middle of nowhere. And yet you did it anyway." Clara's voice remained steady. "You stood there and watched the wagon train pull away, knowing I had no water, no supplies, no way to survive. So forgive me if I don't absolve you just because it wasn't your idea." Margaret's composure cracked, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You're right. You're absolutely right. I was a coward. I should have stood up to him, should have refused to go along with it. But he was my husband, and I was raised to obey, and I—" She stopped, wiping at her eyes. There's no excuse. What we did was unforgivable. Yes, it was. Clara felt her own eyes burning but refused to let the tears fall. You left me to die because I wouldn't marry a man who disgusted me, because I wanted to make my own choices about my own life. That's what I was worth to you, less than keeping the peace with a cruel old man and his land deals. I know. Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. I've known every day since we left you there. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. The guilt was eating me alive. And then your uncle died, and I realized I had nothing keeping me in that settlement, nothing worth staying for. She looked at Clara directly. So I came back to find you, to beg your forgiveness, to try to make amends somehow. Clara stared at her aunt, this woman who'd helped raise her, who'd fed her and housed her, and ultimately betrayed her in the worst possible way. Part of her wanted to scream, to rage, to make Margaret feel even a fraction of the terror and abandonment she'd experienced on that prairie. But another part, the part that had been teaching children for 3 months, that had learned what it meant to show grace even when it was difficult, recognized the genuine anguish in her aunt's face. How did you find me? Clara asked. I went back to where we left you. I had to see... Margaret's voice broke. I had to see if there was anything left. Any sign of what had happened to you. I found the broken trunk, still there after all this time. And I found a rancher who told me he'd heard about a young woman who'd been rescued by a scout, brought to Pueblo. I hoped against hope it might be you. I was rescued by a man named Ethan Cole. He saved my life, helped me get here, gave me the chance to build the life I wanted. Clara's voice softened slightly. Everything you and Uncle tried to take from me, I got anyway. The teaching position, the independence, the freedom to make my own choices. I'm glad. Margaret seemed to mean it. Truly, I'm glad you survived. Glad you're thriving. You deserve all of this and more. She took a tentative step toward Clara. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I needed you to know that what we did haunts me. And I needed to see with my own eyes that you were all right. Clara considered her aunt carefully. Margaret looked older than she remembered, worn down by guilt and grief. There was no triumph in seeing her brought low, no satisfaction in her suffering, just a tired sadness for what could have been if her family had chosen differently. Where are you staying? Clara asked. The boarding house. I have enough money to stay for a few days. Then I'll move on. I have cousins in Denver who've offered to take me in. You're not staying in the settlement? Margaret shook her head. I can't. Too many memories. Too much of your uncle's cruelty embedded in every building, every person there. I need to start fresh somewhere else. She paused. I know I have no right to ask, but would you consider having dinner with me? Just once before I go? I'd like to hear about your life, about your teaching. I'd like to know who you've become. Clara's first instinct was to refuse, to send Margaret away and slam the door on that chapter of her life forever. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the teaching experience, which had shown her that people were complicated, that they could do terrible things and still contain the capacity for growth and change. Maybe it was her own journey, which had taught her that holding on to anger only hurt the person carrying it. Or maybe it was simply that Margaret had come all this way, had faced the weight of her guilt, and was asking for something so small. All right, Clara said finally. Dinner, tomorrow evening, but I'm bringing someone with me. The man who saved you? Yes. Ethan has the right to hear this too. He was part of the story. Margaret nodded. Of course, tomorrow evening. Thank you, Clara. You're more gracious than I deserve. After her aunt left, Clara sank into her chair, her hands shaking. She'd thought she'd processed the abandonment, that she'd moved past it. But seeing Margaret again had ripped open wounds she'd believed were healing. She was still sitting there, staring at nothing, when Ethan arrived. He took one look at her face and was at her side immediately. What happened? Are you hurt? My aunt is here, in Pueblo. She came to find me. Ethan's expression darkened. The woman who left you to die. Yes. Clara looked up at him, and the concern in his eyes made her throat tight. She says my uncle is dead. Says she came back to the place where they abandoned me, then tracked me here to apologize. She wants to have dinner with me tomorrow. And you said? I said yes. I don't know why. Maybe because I need to hear what she has to say. Maybe because I need closure. Clara stood and moved into Ethan's arms, drawing strength from his solid presence. Will you come with me? I told her I was bringing you. Of course. Wherever you need me, I'll be there. Ethan held her close. But Clara, you don't owe her forgiveness. You don't owe her anything. I know, but maybe I need to do this for myself, not for her. They had dinner the next evening at Pueblo's small restaurant, the four of them. Clara, Ethan, Margaret, and the weight of everything that had happened between them. Margaret had dressed carefully, and Clara noticed her aunt's hand shaking as she poured water from the pitcher on the table. For the first part of the meal, they made awkward small talk. Margaret asked about Clara's teaching, and Clara found herself describing her students, the curriculum, the small victories and daily challenges. Ethan talked about his work as deputy sheriff, the growing pains of a frontier town becoming civilized. Margaret listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions, and Clara could see glimpses of the woman she'd once known, before the betrayal, before the abandonment. The aunt who'd taught her to sew, who'd shared recipes, who'd sometimes been kind in small, quiet ways. But the elephant in the room couldn't be ignored forever. Tell me what happened, Clara said finally, setting down her fork. After you left me, what happened on the wagon train? Margaret took a shaky breath. Your uncle was pleased with himself at first, smug about having solved what he called the Clara problem. But then people started asking where you were. Other families on the train who'd noticed you were gone. He told them you'd chosen to stay behind at the last stop, that you'd met a man and decided to get married there instead of continuing on. And they believed him? Ethan's voice was hard. Most did, or if they didn't, they knew better than to question it too directly. Your uncle had a way of making people uncomfortable when they challenged him. Margaret looked at Clara. But I couldn't let it go. I kept thinking about you alone out there, kept having nightmares about what might happen to you. We'd fight about it constantly, your uncle and I. He'd tell me you'd made your choice by refusing Raymond Butcher, that you dug your own grave. So his death, was it natural? Clara asked. Hart gave out. The doctor said it was probably coming for a while, that the stress of the journey and the altitude just accelerated it. Margaret's voice dropped. But I think guilt played a part too. Those last few days he barely spoke, barely ate. He'd just stare off into the distance like he was seeing something the rest of us couldn't. Clara felt a grim satisfaction at this, though she tried not to let it show. And after he died, I realized I was free. Free from his control, free from having to live with what we'd done. I settled his affairs, sold what little property we'd claimed, and came back to find you. Margaret's eyes filled with tears again. I had to know. I couldn't spend the rest of my life wondering if you'd survived, or if I'd helped murder my own niece. The word hung in the air between them. Murder. Because that's what it had been, really. Attempted murder, even if they'd used abandonment as their weapon instead of a gun or a knife. I did survive, Clara said quietly, but not because of anything you or Uncle did. I survived because a good man chose to help a stranger, because I chose to keep fighting even when it seemed hopeless, because I built something from nothing. I can see that. Margaret looked around the restaurant, at the respect people showed Clara when they greeted her, at the way Ethan sat protectively close to her. You've made a real life here. Better than anything you would have had in that settlement, probably. Definitely better, Clara agreed, but that doesn't excuse what you did. No, it doesn't. Margaret reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope, sliding it across the table to Clara. This is yours. The money your father left you when he died. Your uncle took it, claimed it as payment for housing you, but it was never his to take. It's $500, plus interest I've added from what we made selling the settlement property. Consider it part of what I owe you, though I know money can never make up for what we did. Clara stared at the envelope, not touching it. $500 was a significant sum, especially added to what she already had. With over $1,000 in the bank, she'd have true financial security, the ability to weather any crisis. Take it, Margaret urged. Please, it's rightfully yours. Clara picked up the envelope slowly, feeling its weight. This doesn't buy forgiveness. I know, I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm just trying to make what small amends I can before I go. They finished the meal in heavy silence. When it was over, Margaret stood to leave and Clara stood with her. They faced each other across the table, Two women bound by blood and broken by betrayal. I'm leaving for Denver in the morning, Margaret said. I won't trouble you again. But Clara, I want you to know that despite everything, despite how badly I failed you, I am proud of what you've become. Your mother would have been proud too. The mention of her mother, the woman who'd taught her to read, who'd believed in her potential, nearly broke Clara's composure. She blinked back tears and nodded. Goodbye, Aunt Margaret. Goodbye, Clara. Be happy. You've earned it. After Margaret left, Clara and Ethan walked slowly back toward her cottage through the snow-dusted streets. Clara was quiet, processing everything, and Ethan let her have the silence until she was ready to speak. Do you think I should have refused the money? She asked finally. No, it was yours to begin with. Taking it back isn't accepting a bribe for forgiveness. It's reclaiming what was stolen from you. I don't forgive her, Clara said. I don't know if I ever will. What they did was too big, too cruel. You don't have to forgive her. Forgiveness isn't something anyone can demand or deserve. It's something you give when you're ready, if you're ever ready. Ethan stopped walking and turned to face her. But I will say this, she came back. She faced what she'd done. She tried to make what amends she could. That takes a kind of courage. It doesn't undo the harm. No, nothing can undo it. But maybe it's enough that she acknowledged the harm, that she didn't try to justify it or pretend it wasn't as bad as it was. Ethan brushed a snowflake from Clara's hair. You get to decide what this means for you, nobody else. Clara thought about this as they resumed walking. Margaret had given her something valuable beyond the money. She'd given her the truth. No excuses, no justifications, just the plain acknowledgement that what they'd done was unforgivable. There was a strange power in that, in having the betrayal named and owned rather than minimized. I'm glad she came, Clara said suddenly. I didn't think I would be, but I am. It gave me a chance to see that I really have moved on, that I've built something they can't touch or take away. Even seeing her again, hearing about Uncle's death, it didn't break me. I'm stronger than that now. You were always strong, Ethan said. You just didn't know it yet. They reached Clara's cottage and stood on the porch, neither quite ready for the evening to end. The snow was falling steadier now, blanketing Pueblo in white. I've been thinking about the future, Ethan said, about what we talked about at the harvest celebration. Clara's heart began to beat faster. And I think I'm ready. Ready to stop thinking about someday and start thinking about now. He took both her hands in his. Clara Whitmore, these past months with you have been the best of my life. You've made me believe in second chances, in building something permanent, in a future worth fighting for. Ethan, let me finish. He smiled, but his eyes were serious. I know we've only known each other a few months. I know by conventional standards this is too fast. But we've lived more in these months than most people do in years. We've faced death together, built lives together, learned to trust each other in ways that matter. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. When he opened it, Clara saw a simple gold ring with a single small diamond. It's not much, Ethan said, but it's honest work that paid for it, money I earned helping keep this town safe. And I'm offering it to you freely, with no conditions or expectations beyond the hope that you might want to share your life with mine. Clara, will you marry me? Clara looked at the ring, then at Ethan's face, then back at the ring. 6 months ago, she'd been forced toward a marriage she didn't want, with a man she despised by family who saw her as property to be traded. She'd refused, and that refusal had led to her abandonment. But this was different in every way. This was a choice made freely, with a man who respected her, who saw her as an equal, who'd proven repeatedly that he valued her happiness over his own convenience. Yes, she said, and watched joy bloom across Ethan's face. Yes, I'll marry you. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly. Then he pulled her close and kissed her, sweet and deep, a promise of the life they would build together. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Clara laughed with pure happiness. What? Ethan asked, smiling at her joy. I was just thinking. My family tried to force me into a marriage to control me, and when I refused, they left me to die. And now here I am, choosing marriage freely with a man I love, in a place I've made my home, with work I'm passionate about. They tried to destroy me, and instead they freed me to have everything I ever wanted. They didn't free you, Ethan said seriously. You freed yourself. You're the one who refused to give up, who kept fighting, who built this life. Don't give them credit for what you accomplished. You're right. Clara looked at the ring on her finger, at the man who'd given it to her, at the snow-covered town that had become her home. I did this, we did this, together. They made plans over the following weeks. A spring wedding, they decided, when the weather would be warmer and the wildflowers would be blooming. Clara wanted to finish the school year before taking time off for a honeymoon. Ethan wanted to save a bit more money, maybe put a down payment on that house he'd been renting. The news of their engagement spread through Pueblo like wildfire, and Clara was touched by the community's reaction. Her students made her cards and drawings. Parents congratulated her warmly. The school board assured her that marriage wouldn't affect her teaching position. Progressive attitudes for the frontier, but welcome nonetheless. Christmas came, and Clara spent it with Ethan's family of choice. Sheriff Dawson and his wife, a few other deputies, some of the families from her school. It was warm and loud and chaotic, so different from the cold Christmases at her uncle's house where she'd been made to feel like a burden. The new year arrived, bringing with it bitter cold and the deep snows of a Colorado winter. Clara's classroom became a haven of warmth and light where children learned and grew. Ethan continued his work keeping Pueblo safe, building a reputation as a fair but firm lawman. In February, a letter arrived for Clara at the schoolhouse. She recognized the handwriting on the envelope, her aunt's. Inside was a brief note and a photograph. The photograph was old, the edges worn, Clara's parents on their wedding day, young and happy and full of hope. She'd never seen this picture before, hadn't known it existed. The note read, "Found this among your uncle's things. Thought you should have it. They would have been proud of the woman you've become. I know I have no right to say it, but I'm proud of you too. Wishing you every happiness in your marriage and your life, your aunt, Margaret." Clara stared at the photograph for a long time, tracing her mother's face with one finger. Then she placed it carefully in her journal, the beautiful leather-bound one Ethan had given her, and closed the book. Some wounds healed, some didn't. But either way, life went on, and you chose what to carry forward and what to leave behind. Spring arrived with a rush of warmth and color. The prairie around Pueblo exploded with wildflowers, lupines and paintbrush, columbines and daisies. The rivers ran high with snowmelt, and the town buzzed with energy as more settlers arrived and more buildings went up. Clara finished the school year to glowing reviews from students and parents alike. The school board gave her a raise and asked her to help develop curriculum for a second teacher they were hiring. The town was growing fast enough to need 2 classrooms now. And on a perfect May morning, with wildflowers blooming and the sky impossibly blue, Clara Whitmore married Ethan Cole. The ceremony took place in the town's small church, with what seemed like half of Pueblo crammed into the pews. Clara wore a simple white dress she'd sewn herself, with wildflowers in her hair. Ethan wore his best suit, his face radiant as he watched her walk down the aisle. Sheriff Dawson officiated, his normally gruff voice gentle as he spoke about love and commitment, and the courage it took to build a life together in hard country. Clara's students sat in the front rows, beaming with pride at their teacher's happiness. When it came time for the vows, Clara spoke clearly and firmly, her voice carrying through the church. "I, Clara, take you, Ethan, to be my husband. I promise to respect you, to trust you, to stand beside you as an equal partner. I promise to build our future together based on the choices we make freely, with open hearts and honest intentions. I promise to love you, not because I must, but because I choose to, every single day." Ethan's vows were equally simple and equally profound. "I, Ethan, take you, Clara, to be my wife. I promise to honor your strength, to support your dreams, to never try to make you smaller, to make myself feel bigger. I promise to be worthy of the trust you've placed in me, to protect what we build together, and to love you with everything I have, for as long as I live." They exchanged rings, Clara's engagement ring joined by a matching band, Ethan's a simple gold circle, and when the sheriff pronounced them married, the church erupted in applause and cheers. The celebration afterward was joyful and loud, held in the town square with food and music and dancing that lasted until well after dark. Clara danced with her students, with Sheriff Dawson, with half the men in town. But she kept finding her way back to Ethan, drawn to him like iron to a magnet. "Happy?" he asked during one of their dances. "Happier than I ever imagined I could be," Clara said honestly. "You?" "Same." Ethan spun her gently, "though I'll be happier when we can sneak away from this party and start our honeymoon." They'd planned a week away, a trip to a cabin in the mountains that Sheriff Dawson had offered them. A week of peace and privacy to begin their married life. As the sun set and the stars came out, Clara found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her here. She thought about the terrified girl standing alone on the prairie, watching the wagon train disappear. She thought about the desperate flight through the canyons, the moment she'd pulled the trigger and changed her life forever. She thought about every choice she'd made, every time she'd chosen to fight instead of surrender. All of it had led here, to this moment, to this man, to this life she'd built with her own hands. "What are you thinking about?" Ethan asked, noticing her faraway expression. "I'm thinking that I wouldn't change anything," Clara said. "Even the hardest parts, the scariest parts, I wouldn't change them. Because they made me who I am. They brought me here." "Even your family leaving you?" Clara considered this carefully. "Even that. They meant it as destruction, but it became liberation. They tried to kill who I was so I'd become who they wanted. Instead, they just cleared the path for me to become who I was meant to be." Ethan pulled her close. "You're an extraordinary woman, Clara Cole." Clara smiled at the name. Clara Cole. No longer Clara Whitmore, the unwanted niece, the burden, the girl who wouldn't do as she was told. Now she was Clara Cole, teacher, wife, survivor, builder of her own future. "Dance with me," she said, and Ethan swept her into the music. They left for their honeymoon the next morning, riding out of Pueblo on 2 horses, Ethan's reliable buck and a gentle mare named Daisy that Ethan had bought for Clara. They headed into the mountains, following trails Ethan knew, moving through landscape that took Clara's breath away with its wild beauty. The cabin was small but well-maintained, nestled beside a clear stream with mountains rising on all sides. For a week they lived simply, fishing, hiking, talking for hours, learning each other in new and deeper ways. Clara felt herself relax in a way she never had before, letting go of the last defensive walls she'd built around her heart. On their last night at the cabin, they sat outside watching the stars, wrapped in blankets against the mountain chill. "I want to tell you something," Clara said. "Something I haven't told anyone else." "All right. When I was standing on that prairie, when I first realized my family had really left me to die, there was a moment where I thought about just giving up, just sitting down and letting whatever was going to happen, happen. It would have been easier than fighting." Ethan's arm tightened around her, but he didn't interrupt. "But then I got angry, furious actually. I thought, they don't get to win. They don't get to destroy me just because I wouldn't bend, and that anger kept me alive long enough for you to find me." Clara looked up at the stars. "I used to think anger was bad, something to be ashamed of. But that anger saved my life. It gave me the strength to survive until I could find something better to live for." "What did you find to live for?" Ethan asked quietly. "This. Us, the life we're building, the children I teach, the community we're part of, the freedom to make my own choices." Clara turned to face him. "I found purpose. Not the purpose someone else chose for me, but the one I chose for myself. And that's worth everything." They rode back to Pueblo the next day, returning to their lives as a married couple. Ethan had bought the house he'd been renting, and they moved Clara's belongings in, combining their lives in practical and symbolic ways. Summer passed in a blur of work and happiness. Clara began planning for the next school year, excited about the new teacher she'd be mentoring. Ethan took on more responsibilities as deputy, talking with Sheriff Dawson about maybe running for sheriff himself when Dawson retired in a few years. One evening in late August, Clara was working in her garden behind their house when Ethan came home early from patrol. She looked up, surprised, and saw something serious in his expression. "What's wrong?" she asked, standing and brushing dirt from her hands. "Nothing's wrong. But there's something I need to tell you, something I probably should have mentioned before now." Ethan helped her to the porch steps, and they sat together. "I got a letter today. From the army. Clara's stomach tightened. What did they want? They're offering me a position, chief scout for the territory, based out of Fort Collins. It would mean better pay, more authority, working on important mapping and surveying projects. He paused. It's the kind of opportunity that doesn't come along often. Clara felt ice in her veins. Do you want to take it? A year ago, I would have jumped at it. But now? Ethan took her hand. Now I have a life here. A wife I love. A community I'm invested in. And I realized when I was reading that letter that I don't want to go back to that life. I don't want to be the lone scout wandering the frontier anymore. I want to be here, with you, building something that lasts. Relief flooded through Clara. You're sure? I'm sure. I already wrote back declining the offer. Ethan smiled. I hope that's all right with you. Clara laughed and kissed him. More than all right, though I would have supported you if you'd wanted to take it. We would have figured it out. I know. That's one of the reasons I love you. You'd never try to hold me back from something I really wanted. But this isn't what I want. You are. This life is. As autumn arrived and Clara started her second year of teaching, she found herself reflecting on how much had changed in just over a year. She'd gone from being abandoned and alone to being surrounded by love and purpose. She'd found work that fulfilled her, a partner who respected her, and a community that valued her contributions. The nightmares about the canyons had faded, appearing only rarely now. The scar on her wrist from the ropes had become just another mark on her body, no more significant than the calluses from holding chalk or the freckles from summer sun. One October afternoon, Clara was teaching her students about courage, not the dramatic kind found in storybooks, but the everyday courage of standing up for what's right, of making hard choices, of persisting even when things seem impossible. Can anyone give me an example of courage? She asked the class. Elizabeth Chen's hand shot up. You, Miss Cole, coming here and starting over when you had nothing. That's courage. Clara felt her throat tighten with emotion. Thank you, Elizabeth. But I think you're all showing courage too, just by showing up every day ready to learn. Courage isn't always about big dramatic acts. Sometimes it's just about refusing to give up. After school, as Clara was cleaning her blackboard, young Tommy Henderson approached her desk. Miss Cole, I wrote something and I wanted to show you. He handed her a piece of paper covered in his careful handwriting. It was a short essay titled, What I Want to Be When I Grow Up. In it, Tommy wrote about wanting to be a teacher like Miss Cole, someone who helps children learn and grow and believe in themselves. Clara read it twice, her eyes stinging with tears. This is wonderful, Tommy. Truly. You'd make an excellent teacher. Really? You think so? I know so. You're smart and patient and kind to the younger students. Those are all qualities good teachers need. She handed the essay back to him. Keep this. And keep working hard. The world needs good teachers. After Tommy left, Clara sat at her desk for a long time, thinking about the impact one life could have on others. She'd come to Pueblo broken and afraid, and now she was shaping the futures of 20 children. Who knew where those ripples would spread? Who knew what Tommy might accomplish if he really did become a teacher someday? That evening, she told Ethan about the essay, and he smiled with pride. You're changing lives, Clara, making a real difference. So are you. Sheriff Dawson told me you stopped a robbery last week and managed to talk the thief into surrendering without any violence. That's not just good police work, that's compassion. They'd both found their callings, Clara realized. Work that aligned with their values, that let them contribute something meaningful to the world. Winter came again, marking a full year since Clara had first arrived in Pueblo. On the anniversary of that day, she and Ethan rode out to the prairie where they'd first met, or as close to it as they could estimate. The landscape looked different in winter, covered in snow, but Clara could still remember exactly how it had felt to stand there alone, watching the wagon train disappear. What are you feeling? Ethan asked. Gratitude, Clara said simply. Not for what my family did. That was wrong and always will be. But gratitude for what came after, for surviving, for finding you, for building this life. They stood together in the cold wind, two people who'd found each other in the worst circumstances and chosen to create something beautiful. I love you, Clara said, for stopping that day. for not riding past a stranger in trouble, for seeing me as someone worth saving. I love you for being someone worth saving, Ethan replied, and for saving me right back. Because that's what they'd done, Clara realized. They'd saved each other, not just from physical danger, but from loneliness, from hopelessness, from lives half-lived in service to other people's expectations. They rode back to Pueblo as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Home, Clara thought. She was riding home to a life she'd chosen, with a man she loved, toward a future she'd built with her own hands. Clara Whitmore Cole, teacher, wife, survivor, had learned the most important lesson of all. You could lose everything and still have everything. You could be betrayed by those who should love you and still find love in unexpected places. You could start with nothing and build a life of profound meaning and joy. All it took was courage, determination, and the willingness to keep choosing hope, even when hope seemed foolish. Clara had all of those things in abundance now. She'd been forged in fire and emerged as steel, strong, flexible, unbreakable. And she would carry that strength forward into whatever came next, ready for every challenge, grateful for every blessing, free at last to live the life she'd always dreamed of. The abandoned girl on the prairie was gone forever, replaced by a woman who knew her own worth and refused to settle for anything less than she deserved. And in the end, that transformation was the greatest gift her family's betrayal could have given her, the opportunity to discover who she truly was when all the expectations and obligations were stripped away. She was Clara Cole. She was a teacher. She was a wife. She was a survivor. And she was finally, completely, gloriously free.